There is a particular quiet that belongs to Saturday mornings, a hush that seems woven from something older than memory, something that carries the weight of ritual and the lightness of anticipation all at once. And in that quiet, before the world becomes fully awake, there exists a threshold, a place where time moves differently, where the television screen glows with a gentle luminescence, casting soft blue light across darkened living rooms, across bowls of cereal that sit waiting, across pajama-clad children who have risen before their parents, drawn by something they cannot quite name. The history of Saturday morning television cartoons is not simply a chronicle of entertainment. It is a map of childhood itself, charted across decades, drawn in bold primary colors, and set to music that still echoes in corridors of collective memory. And to trace this history is to walk backwards through time, through layers of cultural change, through shifting technologies and evolving sensibilities, until we arrive at a moment when broadcasting networks first recognize the strange magic of this particular day, this particular time slot, when the adult world still slumbered and children commanded the airwaves. There is something almost archaeological about this journey, as if we are sifting through strata of animation cells and broadcast schedules, uncovering the remnants of Saturday morning's past, each layer revealing something about the era that produced it, about what children were thought to need, what they were believed to desire, and what stories were deemed suitable for their consumption in those precious hours between dawn and noon. The glow of the television in a dark room has its own quality, distinct from any other light. It flickers and pulses with the rhythm of the broadcast, creating shadows that dance along walls. And in the 1950s and 1960s, when this phenomenon first began to take shape, that glow represented something revolutionary, a new kind of gathering place, a digital hearth around which a generation would assemble, without fully understanding that they were participating in the birth of a tradition. Before Saturday mornings became synonymous with cartoons, before the ritual solidified into something that felt eternal and unchanging, there was simply television itself, still new, still finding its way, still learning what it could be and what it might become. And the networks, those great broadcasting entities with their towers and transmission signals reaching across cities and states, were conducting a vast experiment, testing boundaries, exploring possibilities, searching for audiences in every conceivable time slot and demographic category. Children, it turned out, were early risers, particularly on weekends when school released its grip and time stretched out with seemingly infinite possibility. And while parents sought the luxury of sleeping late on Saturday mornings, their offspring were awake, alert, and in need of something to occupy their attention. This presented both a challenge and an opportunity for broadcasters who saw in this situation the potential for a captive audience, young viewers whose loyalty might be cultivated, whose preferences might be shaped, whose Saturday mornings might be claimed. The cartoons that would come to fill these hours were descendants of theatrical shorts, those brief animated films that had once played before feature presentations in movie houses across the country. Characters like Bugs Bunny and Daffy Duck, Tom and Jerry, Woody Woodpecker, had been born for the big screen, crafted by studios with names that would become legendary: Warner Brothers, Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer, Walter Lantz Productions. These were animations designed for general audiences, family entertainment that parents and children might enjoy together in the dark sanctuary of a theater. But television demanded something different. It required content that could fill hours rather than minutes, that could be produced economically, that could be broadcast repeatedly without exhausting its appeal. And so began a transformation, a reimagining of what animation could be, what it might become when freed from the constraints of theatrical exhibition and remade for the small screen, for the intimacy of the living room, for children watching alone or with siblings, without adult supervision or mediation. The technology itself was evolving. Animation techniques were adapting to new requirements, to smaller budgets and faster production schedules, to the limitations and possibilities of broadcast television. Artists and studios were learning to work within these constraints, discovering efficiencies, developing shortcuts, creating new aesthetic approaches that would define the look and feel of television animation for decades to come. And threading through all of this, through the business decisions and technological adaptations, through the creative innovations and the commercial calculations, there runs a narrative about childhood itself, about what it means to be young in America, about the stories we tell our children and the values we embed within those stories, about imagination and commerce, education and entertainment, all converging in that magical window of time on Saturday mornings when the screen glowed and anything seemed possible. The story truly begins in the years immediately following the Second World War, when television itself was still finding its footing in American homes, still proving its worth as more than a novelty, still establishing the patterns and rhythms that would come to define it in those early years. In the late 1940s and early 1950s, television programming followed the contours of radio, borrowing formats, adapting familiar shows, creating schedules that mirrored the patterns already established through sound alone. Saturday mornings, in those pioneer days of broadcasting, belonged largely to agricultural programming, to shows designed for rural audiences who rose with the sun regardless of the day. There were farm reports and livestock updates, discussions of seed prices and weather patterns, content that served a specific demographic and purpose, but left vast swaths of the viewing audience, particularly the young, entirely unserved. The networks in those years were few. NBC and CBS dominated the landscape. ABC existed but struggled to compete, and Dumont, a network now largely forgotten, fought for survival in a rapidly consolidating industry. Each of these entities operated under different constraints, different philosophies, different visions of what television might become. And it was within this competitive environment that the Saturday morning landscape would begin to take shape. The first tentative steps toward children's programming on Saturday mornings came not from animation, but from live-action shows, programs that featured hosts and studio audiences, that incorporated games and contests, that brought a circus-like atmosphere to the small screen. Shows like Big Top, which aired on CBS beginning in 1950, brought the spectacle of the circus into living rooms, complete with clowns and acrobats, lions and elephants, all contained within the modest frame of a television screen. These early children's shows understood something fundamental about their audience, that children craved spectacle, movement, surprise, elements that live performance could provide, but that required considerable resources and careful choreography. The logistics of producing such shows week after week of maintaining the energy and novelty proved challenging and expensive, and the networks began searching for alternatives, for content that could be produced more economically, that could be repeated without losing its appeal, that could fill hours rather than minutes. Animation emerged as the answer, but not animation created specifically for television, at least not at first. The studios that had produced theatrical cartoons for decades possessed vast libraries of existing content, shorts that had already been shown in theaters, that had already earned their initial revenue, and that now sat in vaults waiting. These cartoons represented a ready-made solution to the problem of Saturday morning programming, content that could be acquired relatively inexpensively, that required no ongoing production costs, that children had either never seen or would happily watch again. Warner Brothers was among the first to recognize this opportunity. The studio's Looney Tunes and Merry Melodies cartoons, featuring characters already beloved by multiple generations, began appearing on television in the mid-1950s. These were not the full theatrical shorts in many cases, but rather edited versions, trimmed to fit television time slots, altered to accommodate commercial breaks, adapted to the technical requirements of the broadcast medium. The transition was not seamless. Theatrical cartoons had been designed for large screens, for audiences sitting in darkened theaters, for viewing experiences that were communal and occasional. Television required something different. It demanded content that could work on smaller screens, that could be watched casually, that could be interrupted without losing narrative coherence, and so the cartoons were modified, their pacing adjusted, their content sometimes altered to suit the sensibilities of network censors who worried about violence and behavior they deemed inappropriate for unsupervised young viewers. CBS made a significant move in 1955 with The Mighty Mouse Playhouse. This was something new, a program built entirely around existing theatrical cartoons featuring the caped rodent superhero, but presented with a host, with linking segments, with an attempt to create a show. Rather than simply broadcasting a series of disconnected shorts, the format proved successful, drawing audiences, attracting sponsors, demonstrating that Saturday mornings could be profitable territory for networks willing to invest in children's programming. The host, in this case a live actor interacting with animated elements, provided continuity, created a sense of occasion, made the viewing experience feel special rather than random. This model would be replicated and refined over subsequent years, becoming a template for how to package animated content for television audiences, how to transform individual cartoons into cohesive programs that could command regular viewership and generate advertising revenue. NBC entered the field with The Rough and Ready Show in 1957, and this marked another crucial development because Rough and Ready were not theatrical characters being repurposed for television. They were created specifically for the small screen by William Hanna and Joseph Barbera, animators who had spent years at Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer creating Tom and Jerry shorts, but who now found themselves independent, forming their own studio, and pioneering a new approach to animation designed explicitly for television's unique demands. Hanna-Barbera revolutionized television animation through what they termed limited animation, a technique that reduced the number of individual drawings required for each second of screen time. Theatrical cartoons have been produced using full animation, with characters rendered in elaborate detail, moving with fluid grace, every gesture and expression carefully crafted. But this approach was prohibitively expensive for television, where budgets were constrained and production schedules relentless. Limited animation employed strategies to reduce costs while maintaining visual appeal. Backgrounds remained static while characters moved against them. Characters were designed with separate heads and bodies, so that only the speaking mouth needed to be redrawn for dialogue scenes. Action was suggested rather than shown in full detail. Walk cycles were shortened and repeated, and storytelling relied more heavily on dialogue and sound effects to compensate for reduced visual movement. Critics would later argue that limited animation represented a degradation, a cheapening of the art form, and there was truth in this assessment. The technique did sacrifice the fluid grace of theatrical animation, the elaborate sight gags, the virtuosic displays of drawing skill, but it also made television animation economically viable. It allowed for the creation of new characters and new stories specifically designed for young audiences watching at home on Saturday mornings. And in this trade-off, something was gained even as something else was lost. The Huckleberry Hound show debuted in 1958, also from Hanna-Barbera, and became a phenomenon. The blue dog with the southern drawl and easygoing demeanor captured something essential about the late 1950s, a kind of gentle humor, a resistance to conflict, a world where problems were small and solutions always within reach. The show was syndicated, meaning it appeared on different stations at different times rather than on a single network, but it found its natural home in morning and early afternoon time slots, particularly on Saturdays. Accompanying Huckleberry Hound were other characters who would become fixtures of the era. Yogi Bear, a smarter-than-average bear residing in Jellystone Park, constantly scheming to separate tourists from their picnic baskets while evading Ranger Smith, and Pixie and Dixie, two mice tormented by Mr. Jinx, a cat whose antagonism was always tempered by affection. These characters inhabited a safe world, a world where violence had no consequences, where pursuit never ended in capture, where tomorrow would bring the same cheerful conflicts as today. The success of Hanna-Barbera's approach prompted other studios to enter television animation. J. Ward Productions created Rocky and His Friends in 1959, featuring the adventures of Arcasius Rocky the Flying Squirrel and Bullwinkle the Moose, along with supporting segments like Fractured Fairy Tales and Peabody's Improbable History. Ward's sensibility was different from Hanna-Barbera's, more satirical, more willing to include jokes aimed at adults, more self-aware about the absurdity of the animated medium itself. The animation in Rocky and Bullwinkle was even more limited than Hanna-Barbera's work, almost crude by theatrical standards, but the writing was sharp, the wordplay clever, the serialized storylines with their cliffhanger endings created appointment viewing. Children tuned in not just for the characters but to see how the story would continue, how Rocky and Bullwinkle would escape their latest predicament, how Boris Badenov and Natasha Fatali's schemes would be foiled by the end of the 1950s. Saturday morning television had begun to establish itself as a distinct phenomenon, a time when children could claim the television for themselves, when programming was designed specifically for their interests and attention spans, when the adult world receded and a child's world, colorful and uncomplicated, filled the screen the networks had discovered that this audience was valuable, that sponsors would pay to reach children, that entire product lines could be marketed during these hours, and that the cartoons themselves could become vehicles for merchandising, for selling toys and cereals and lunchboxes bearing the likenesses of beloved characters. The foundation had been laid, the economic model established, the creative approaches developed, and as the calendar turned to a new decade, as the 1960s began, Saturday morning cartoons stood poised to enter what would later be probably remembered as a golden age, an era of expansion and innovation when new characters would multiply across the dial, when the format would solidify into ritual, when millions of children would gather each week before glowing screens, drawn by something that had barely existed a decade before, but that now seemed as eternal and necessary as Saturday morning itself. The 1960s arrived with a kind of technicolor exuberance, a sense that television had matured enough to take risks, to experiment, to push beyond the simple formulas that had defined the previous decade. And nowhere was this more evident than in the explosion of animated programming that began to fill Saturday mornings, transforming them from a collection of scattered offerings into a carefully orchestrated block of entertainment, designed to capture young viewers from the moment they opened their eyes until well past noon. In 1960, Hanna-Barbera premiered The Flintstones in Prime Time, an animated sitcom aimed at adults, featuring a Stone Age family whose adventures parodied contemporary suburban life. But the show's success demonstrated something crucial, that animation could appeal to broad audiences, that it could sustain narrative complexity, that it could become a weekly habit for viewers across demographics. And while The Flintstones aired in the evening, its influence rippled into Saturday morning programming, encouraging networks to invest more heavily in animated content, to see it as something more than mere babysitting for children whose parents wanted to sleep late. The early 1960s saw an acceleration, a proliferation of new shows and new characters. The Yogi Bear show spun off from Huckleberry Hound in 1961, giving the picnic basket stealing bear his own program, complete with supporting characters like Snagglepuss, a pink mountain lion with theatrical aspirations and a tendency to exit stage left, and Top Cat, which debuted the same year, featuring an alley cat and his gang navigating the streets of New York, their schemes and scams echoing the urban comedy of the Phil Silvers show, but rendered in animation. What distinguished these shows from their predecessors was an increasing sophistication in storytelling. Characters developed recognizable personalities. Episodes followed coherent narrative arcs. The worlds they inhabited felt consistent, governed by their own internal logic. Children watching could anticipate how characters would behave, could predict plot developments, could feel the satisfaction of expectations confirmed or the delight of surprise when stories took unexpected turns. The production process itself became more streamlined, more efficient. Hanna-Barbera operated like a factory, churning out enormous quantities of animation through assembly line methods. Background artists created libraries of reusable settings. Character designers developed models that could be replicated quickly. Voice actors recorded dialogue for multiple characters in single sessions. The studio's output was prodigious, at times producing more animated content in a year than all the theatrical cartoon studios had produced in a decade. Other studios watched Hanna-Barbera's success and sought to replicate it. Filmation Associates, founded in 1962 by Lou Scheimer and Hal Sutherland, entered the Saturday morning landscape with shows like The New Adventures of Superman in 1966, bringing the DC comic superhero to television in animated form. The show marked a shift toward action-oriented programming, toward stories of heroes and villains, conflicts resolved through strength and courage rather than clever schemes or lucky accidents. Superheroes began to dominate Saturday mornings in the mid-1960s. The Marvel superheroes debuted in 1966, presenting Captain America, Iron Man, the Hulk, Thor, and Submariner in barely animated segments that often consisted of comic book panels with minimal movement. The technique was crude even by limited animation standards, but children didn't seem to mind. They were captivated by the characters, by the mythology, by the ongoing battles between good and evil that stretched across episodes and story arcs. CBS launched its Superhero Saturday lineup in 1967, a coordinated block of programming featuring multiple superhero shows back-to-back, creating an event out of Saturday morning viewing. The network recognized that children would remain loyal to a channel if given a compelling reason. If the transition from one show to the next felt seamless, if leaving meant missing something important, and so the strategy of block programming began to take shape, transforming Saturday mornings from a loose collection of individual shows into a carefully designed experience. Space Ghost arrived in 1966 from Hanna-Barbera, representing the studio's entry into the superhero genre. The caped cosmic crime fighter traveled through space with teenage sidekicks, Jan and Jace, accompanied by a monkey named Blip, battling intergalactic villains with the help of power bands that gave him various abilities. The show's design aesthetic, with its bold lines and dramatic color schemes, its space-age architecture and alien landscapes, captured the era's fascination with the cosmos, with the space race that dominated headlines, with the possibility of worlds beyond our own. The music that accompanied these shows deserves particular attention, for it became inseparable from the experience of Saturday morning viewing. Composers created theme songs designed to burrow into young minds, to be hummed and sung throughout the week, to create instant recognition and anticipation. The Spider-Man theme that debuted in 1967 with the character's animated series became perhaps the most enduring of all, its lyrics explaining the hero's powers and motivations in catchy verse, its melody infectious and impossible to forget. Hoyt Curtin composed scores for dozens of Hanna-Barbera shows, developing a distinctive sound, jazzy and energetic, that defined the audio landscape of Saturday mornings. His themes for Johnny Quest, The Jetsons, Scooby-Doo became as recognizable as the characters themselves. The music created mood and atmosphere, signaled transitions, underscored action, and provided a kind of sonic continuity across different programs, so that Saturday morning had not just a visual identity, but an oral one as well. Johnny Quest premiered in 1964 and represented something of an anomaly, a show produced with higher animation quality than typical Saturday morning fare, featuring more realistic character designs, more elaborate action sequences, more serious storytelling that included genuine peril and consequences. The show followed a boy adventurer and his companions, his scientist father, his adoptive brother Haji, their bodyguard Race Bannon, and their dog Bandit, as they traveled the world encountering mysteries and dangers. The show's production values reflected its primetime origins. It had initially been designed for evening viewing, and when it moved to Saturday mornings after its first season, it stood out for its cinematic qualities, its willingness to embrace darkness and menace, its use of exotic locations and complex plots, but it also proved too expensive to sustain, demonstrating the economic limits of what Saturday morning budgets could support. And after a single season of new episodes, it went into reruns, becoming a beloved artifact that would be repeated throughout the decade. By the late 1960s, the Saturday morning landscape had become intensely competitive. All three major networks fought for young viewers, programming entire blocks from early morning through early afternoon. The shows multiplied and diversified. There were adventure shows and comedy shows, superhero shows and family shows, shows featuring talking animals, and shows featuring teenagers solving mysteries. The variety seemed endless, and yet certain patterns emerged. Certain formulas proved reliable. Certain types of stories and characters resonated more strongly than others. Scooby-Doo, Where Are You? Debuted on CBS in 1969 and became perhaps the most influential Saturday morning cartoon of its era. The show featured 4 teenagers and their Great Dane investigating supposedly supernatural mysteries that invariably turned out to have rational explanations. The formula was simple but endlessly repeatable. The gang would arrive at a location, encounter something mysterious or frightening, split up to investigate, fall into various predicaments, unmask the villain, and explain how the hoax was perpetrated. What made Scooby-Doo work was its perfect calibration to its audience. It offered scares that were never too scary, mysteries that were solvable, humor that came from character, interplay, and physical comedy. The show understood that children wanted to feel frightened in a controlled way, wanted to encounter danger from the safety of their living rooms, wanted to solve puzzles and feel clever. And the characters themselves, the brave leader Fred, the intelligent Velma, the pretty Daphne, the cowardly Shaggy, and the even more cowardly Scooby, provided models of friendship and cooperation, of working together to overcome challenges. The voice acting in these shows carried enormous weight. Actors like Don Messick, Mel Blanc, Dawes Butler, June Foray created dozens of distinct characters through vocal performance alone. Their skills allowed limited animation to work, because even when characters stood still or moved minimally, their voices brought them to life, gave them personality, made them memorable. Children recognized their favorite characters by sound as much as sight, could identify Bugs Bunny or Yogi Bear or Quick Draw McGraw within seconds of hearing them speak. Saturday morning viewing had become, by the end of the 1960s, a genuine cultural phenomenon, something that united children across geographic and social boundaries, in cities and suburbs and small towns. Children gathered before television screens each Saturday, experiencing the same shows, laughing at the same jokes, following the same stories. It created a shared language, a common reference point, and the experience was enhanced by the commercials that punctuated the programming, advertisements for sugary cereals and cheap toys that became part of the ritual that children anticipated almost as eagerly as the shows themselves. The cereals in particular became legendary. Brands like Quisp and Quake, Frankenberry and Count Chocula, King Vitaman and Cap'n Crunch, each with their own animated mascot, their own mythology, their own jingles and catchphrases. The boundary between programming and advertising blurred as cartoon characters sold products and products featured cartoon characters, creating a commercial ecosystem that critics would later condemn, but that children navigated with surprising sophistication, understanding the difference between stories and sales pitches, even as they enjoyed both. The toy commercials promised transformation. G.I. Joe figures that could be posed in infinite action scenarios, Hot Wheels cars that raced on bright orange tracks, easy bake ovens that allowed children to create real food with a light bulb. These advertisements sold not just products, but possibilities, suggesting that the right toy could unlock creativity, adventure, independence, and while the reality rarely matched the promise, the commercials themselves became part of the Saturday morning tapestry, memorable in their own right, quoted and referenced and remembered long after the products disappeared from stores. As the 1970s approached, Saturday morning cartoons had reached a kind of zenith. The format had been perfected, the audience had been captured, the economic model had been proven, but change was already stirring. New concerns about children's television were emerging, questions about violence and advertising, about educational value and nutritional responsibility, forces that would reshape Saturday mornings in the decade to come, pushing the medium in new directions, creating new restrictions and new opportunities. But for now, in these final years of the 1960s, Saturday morning cartoons represented something pure, uncomplicated, a weekly escape into worlds of color and sound, where good triumphed and humor prevailed, where the next adventure was always just 7 days away. The 1970s opened with a shift in the cultural winds. Concerns that had been whispered in the late 1960s now found voice and volume. Parent groups and child psychologists, educators and lawmakers began questioning what children were watching during those unsupervised Saturday morning hours, what messages they were absorbing, what behaviors they might be learning from the endless parade of cartoon violence and commercial appeals. The controversy centered on two interrelated issues: the amount of violent content in children's programming and the nature of advertising directed at young viewers. Critics pointed to shows where conflicts were resolved through physical confrontation, where characters hit and kicked and chased each other with mallets and anvils, where the humor derived from pain inflicted and disasters narrowly avoided. They argued that such content normalized aggression, taught children that violence was an acceptable response to frustration, that problems could be solved through force. The advertising question cut even deeper. During Saturday morning broadcasts, commercials appeared approximately every few minutes, selling products designed to appeal to children who had no independent income, no ability to make purchasing decisions, yet who could influence their parents through persistent requests and pleas? The products themselves, heavily sugared cereals and cheaply made toys, raised questions about nutrition and value, about exploitation and responsibility. Action for children's television, an advocacy group founded in 1968 by Peggy Charon, became the most prominent voice calling for reform. The organization didn't seek to eliminate children's programming or ban commercials outright, but rather to raise standards, to reduce commercial time, to improve content quality, to ensure that television served children's developmental needs rather than simply extracting profit from their attention. Their campaigns found sympathetic ears in government, and regulatory pressure began to mount on networks and advertisers alike. The networks responded with a mixture of resistance and accommodation. They created standards and practices departments, hired consultants to review content, developed guidelines about acceptable levels of cartoon violence. What emerged was a peculiar form of self-censorship, where action shows could continue but had to minimize certain types of consequences, where characters could be chased but not caught, could fall from cliffs but had to bounce back unharmed, could be hit with objects that left stars circling their heads but no lasting injury. The result was a kind of sanitization, a draining away of genuine stakes or peril. Superhero shows in the early 1970s featured heroes who rarely threw punches, who instead used their powers to build things or solve problems, who talked villains into surrendering rather than fighting them into submission. Super Friends debuted in 1973, featuring DC Comics heroes like Superman, Batman, Wonder Woman, and Aquaman working together as a team, but the show's conflicts were notably bloodless, its villains more misguided than malevolent, its resolutions invariably peaceful. Simultaneously, networks began incorporating educational content into Saturday morning lineups. Schoolhouse Rock premiered in 1973 on ABC, presenting short animated segments between regular programming that taught grammar, mathematics, history, and civics through catchy songs and clever visuals. Conjunction, Junction, I'm Just a Bill, 3 is a magic number, became embedded in the consciousness of a generation, teaching lessons that would outlast most of the cartoons that surrounded them. The educational mandate extended to full-length programs as well. Shows like The Jackson 5 combined entertainment with positive messages about cooperation and understanding. Fat Albert and the Cosby Kids, which debuted in 1972, featured stories that addressed real issues facing urban youth, peer pressure and poverty, family dynamics, and self-esteem. Each episode concluded with Bill Cosby appearing live to reinforce the moral lesson, to connect the animated story to real-world application. But even as networks attempted to balance commercial imperatives with social responsibility, the fundamental economics of Saturday morning television remained unchanged. The shows existed to deliver audiences to advertisers, to create environments where children would be receptive to commercial messages. And the tension between these dual purposes, entertainment and salesmanship, education and profit, would define Saturday morning programming throughout the decade. Hanna-Barbera continued to dominate production, but their output in the 1970s reflected the changing climate. Shows became gentler, more focused on mystery and adventure than action and conflict. Josie and the Pussycats featured an all-girl rock band solving mysteries while touring. The Funky Phantom paired teenagers with a Revolutionary War-era ghost. Speed Buggy gave personality to a sentient dune buggy and its teenage companions. These shows followed safe formulas, repeated successful patterns, offered comfort through familiarity. The studio also began producing shows based on existing live-action properties. The Brady Kids animated the characters from the popular sitcom The Brady Bunch, giving them adventures that would have been impossible or prohibitively expensive in live action. This trend of adapting existing properties would accelerate throughout the decade as networks sought to leverage brand recognition to attract audiences already familiar with characters from other media. New studios emerged to challenge Hanna-Barbera's dominance. Despatie-Freleng Enterprises, founded by former Warner Brothers animation veterans, produced The Pink Panther Show and later The Super Six and The Ant and the Aardvark. Their work retained some of the theatrical quality of classic Warner Brothers cartoons, a slightly sharper edge, a more sophisticated visual style, though still constrained by television budgets and schedules. Filmation continued producing action shows but adapted to the new climate. The New Adventures of Gilligan brought the castaways from Gilligan's Island into animation. Star Trek, the animated series, debuted in 1973. Continuing the adventures of the Enterprise crew with the original cast, providing voices, the show demonstrated that animation could tackle complex science fiction concepts, could appeal to older children and even adults, could be something more than simple entertainment for the very young. The mid-1970s saw an explosion of licensed properties, shows based on toys, comic books, movies, live-action television series. The Muppet Babies imagined Jim Henson's characters as children. Rubik the Amazing Cube built a series around a puzzle toy. Pac-Man transformed a video game into a family adventure. The line between content and commercial became increasingly blurred as entire shows functioned essentially as extended advertisements for product lines. Yet within this commercialization, moments of genuine creativity persisted. Schoolhouse Rock proved that educational content could be entertaining. Super Friends, despite its limitations, brought DC's pantheon to Saturday mornings, introducing characters like the Wonder Twins and Apache Chief, creating mythology that would influence how a generation understood superhero storytelling and individual episodes of various shows. Particularly those written by talented freelancers managed to transcend their commercial constraints, to tell stories that resonated, that stayed with viewers long after the toys had been discarded and the serials discontinued. The late 1970s brought another significant shift. The rise of cable television, stations like Nickelodeon, which launched in 1979, promised commercial-free children's programming, though this promise would not last. They offered alternatives to network Saturday morning blocks, different philosophies about what children's television could be. And while their initial reach was limited, their very existence signaled that the network's monopoly on children's attention was beginning to fracture. Home's video technology, still in its infancy, hinted at future disruptions. The ability to record programs, to watch them at times other than their scheduled broadcast, threatened the very premise of appointment viewing, of children gathering at specific times to watch specific shows, though these technologies would not reach critical mass until the following decade. Their potential was already visible, already beginning to influence how content was created and distributed. The 1980s arrived with Saturday morning cartoons facing an uncertain future, The format that had seemed eternal just a decade earlier now appeared vulnerable, subject to regulatory pressure, technological disruption, changing viewing habits, and evolving expectations about what children's programming should accomplish. The shows that had defined the 1970s, the gentle mysteries and educational segments, the licensed properties, and sanitized action, would give way to something different, to shows more directly tied to toy lines, to increased competition from cable networks, to a gradual erosion of the Saturday morning ritual itself. But before that erosion became complete, before cable and home video, and eventually streaming, would transform how children consumed entertainment, there came a final flowering, a last great era of Saturday morning dominance in the 1980s. Shows like The Smurfs, which debuted in 1981 and became NBC's anchor program, drawing massive audiences and running for 9 seasons. Muppet Babies, which premiered in 1984 and won multiple Emmy Awards. Garfield and Friends, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, programs that captured the zeitgeist, that became cultural phenomena, that demonstrated Saturday morning cartoons still possessed the power to unite and captivate young audiences. These shows of the 1980s differed from their predecessors. They were more likely to be based on existing properties, more tightly integrated with merchandising strategies, more conscious of their role in larger commercial ecosystems. But they also benefited from improved animation techniques, from writers who had grown up watching Saturday morning cartoons and understood their rhythms and possibilities, from voice actors who brought depth and nuance to their performances. The shows were products of their time, shaped by commercial forces and regulatory requirements, but also by genuine creative ambition. The landscape continued evolving through the decade. Fox launched as a fourth network in 1986 and immediately targeted Saturday mornings, bringing a more aggressive, less cautious approach to children's programming. Their shows like Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles pushed back against the sanitization of the 1970s, reintroducing action and conflict, and finding enormous success in the process, proving that audiences had tired of overly gentle fare, that they craved stories with genuine stakes and excitement. Cable networks expanded their reach. Nickelodeon and the Disney Channel, Turner Broadcasting's Cartoon Network, each offered alternatives to network Saturday morning blocks, different philosophies, different content, and increasingly, children had choices, could find programming that suited their specific interests, rather than accepting whatever the 3 major networks decided to broadcast. The audience fragmented, divided among multiple channels and viewing options, and the communal experience of Saturday morning cartoons, of millions of children watching the same shows at the same time, began its long, slow fade. By the early 1990s, the Saturday morning landscape had fundamentally changed. Networks still broadcast children's programming during these hours, still attracted substantial audiences, but the sense of event, of ritual, of special time set apart had diminished. Children watched cartoons throughout the week on cable channels, recorded shows on VCRs to watch whenever convenient, rented animated movies from video stores. The scarcity that had made Saturday mornings precious no longer existed, and with abundance came a kind of diffusion, a loss of focus and intensity. The quality of animation had improved dramatically. computer-assisted techniques allowed for more elaborate visuals, more consistent character designs, more ambitious action sequences. Shows like Batman, the animated series, which premiered in 1992, demonstrated that television animation could achieve theatrical quality, could tell sophisticated stories, could be taken seriously as an art form. But these shows often aired in afternoon or early evening slots, not Saturday mornings, which were increasingly seen as less prestigious, less important to network strategies. And so the era wound down, not with a dramatic ending, but with a gradual diminishment. Saturday morning cartoons continued through the 1990s and into the 2000s. Networks still filled the hours with animated programming, but the cultural centrality, the sense that these shows mattered, that they shaped childhood experience, slowly evaporated, replaced by a media landscape of infinite choice and constant availability, where cartoons could be watched anytime, anywhere, on televisions or computers, or eventually phones and tablets. The deepening comes when we consider what was truly happening during those Saturday morning hours, beneath the surface narratives of cartoon cats chasing cartoon mice, beneath the adventures of superheroes and the mysteries solved by meddling kids. Something more fundamental was occurring, a kind of collective dreaming. Millions of children sitting in darkened living rooms, their attention focused on glowing screens, their imaginations activated by simple drawings that moved and spoke. These cartoons were teaching more than they intended, not the explicit lessons of Fat Albert or Schoolhouse Rock, but subtler things. They taught narrative structure, how stories begin and develop and resolve. They taught character archetypes, the hero and the sidekick, the villain and the fool, the innocent and the trickster. They created a shared mythology, a common language of references and jokes and catchphrases that would bind generations together, allowing strangers to connect through mutual recognition of "What's up, Doc?" or "Zoinks," or "I would have gotten away with it too." The ritual itself carried meaning, the act of waking early on a day when sleep was permitted, of claiming the television before parents or siblings, of settling into a favorite spot with a bowl of cereal. This was a form of independence, a small sovereignty that children exercised over their Saturday mornings. They chose which channel to watch, when to change stations, whether to remain engaged or let attention drift. These were perhaps among the first autonomous decisions many children made, the first exercises of preference and will in a life otherwise directed by adults. And there was the texture of it, the specific feeling of those mornings, the quality of light filtering through curtains, the sound of cartoon voices mingling with the clink of spoon against bowl, the slight chill of a house not yet warmed by movement and activity, the sense of time suspended, stretched out, not yet claimed by obligations or expectations. These sensory details embedded themselves deeply, became part of how children understood Saturday itself, what it meant, what it felt like, how it differed from every other day. The commercials, despite their commercial intent, despite being designed explicitly to manipulate desire, also became part of the cultural education. They taught children about persuasion, about the difference between claim and reality, about wanting and having and the gap between the two. The toys never looked quite as good at home as they did on screen. The cereals never tasted quite as magical. And in learning this, in experiencing repeated small disappointments, children developed a kind of media literacy, a healthy skepticism about advertising that would serve them throughout life. The violence question, which so concerned critics and reformers, was perhaps more complex than either side acknowledged. Yes, cartoons featured characters hitting each other, falling from heights, being flattened and stretched and exploded, but children understood at some level that this was not real violence, not something to emulate. The physics were wrong, the consequences absent, the whole enterprise obviously fantastical, and perhaps there was value in this, in having a safe space to encounter aggression and conflict, to see it rendered harmless and silly, to laugh at it rather than fear it. The characters themselves, simple as they were, served as companions, as friends who appeared reliably every Saturday, who never changed, never aged, never disappointed. Scooby-Doo would always be cowardly but loyal. Bugs Bunny would always outsmart his adversaries. The Super Friends would always save the world. There was comfort in this constancy, in knowing that no matter what changed in a child's life, these characters would remain, would continue their eternal loops of conflict and resolution, pursuit and escape. And perhaps most importantly, Saturday morning cartoons created space for imagination to work. The limited animation, the simple plots, the two-dimensional worlds, left room for children to fill in details, to elaborate on what they saw, to extend the stories in their own minds beyond what appeared on screen. A child watching Johnny Quest might imagine themselves as part of the team, might dream up their own adventures, might create internal narratives that enriched and expanded the televised version, the music, those theme songs and incidental scores, operated on children's minds in ways that bypassed conscious thought. The melodies lodged themselves in memory, creating neural pathways that would remain accessible decades later. A few notes of the Spider-Man theme could transport someone instantly back to childhood, to a specific room, a specific feeling, a specific moment of pure absorption in story. This was the power of music combined with narrative, of sound welded to vision, of rhythm matching the rhythms of childhood itself. There was also something about the communal aspect. Even though children typically watched alone or with siblings, they were participating in something larger, millions of other children watching the same shows, laughing at the same jokes, following the same stories. And on Monday mornings at school, these shared experiences became social currency, ways to connect, to establish belonging, to find common ground with classmates and friends. Did you see? Became a ritual greeting, a way of confirming membership in the tribe of childhood. The closing comes gently, like the end of a Saturday morning itself, when cartoons gave way to sports programming or educational shows clearly designed for adults. When the spell broke and the regular world reasserted itself, when parents emerged from bedrooms and the house filled with activity and noise, when the magic hours ended and ordinary time resumed. Saturday morning cartoons as a cultural institution lasted roughly 4 decades in their fullest form, from the late 1950s through the late 1990s, a specific window in media history when technology and economics and cultural factors aligned to create something unique, something that had never existed before and would never exist again in quite the same way. The combination of broadcast scarcity and advertising economics of children's early waking habits and parental desire for weekend sleep, of animation technology, affordable enough for television, but sophisticated enough to enchant. All these elements came together for a brief historical moment. The end, when it came, was gradual, a slow dissolution rather than a sharp break. Cable channels offered cartoons throughout the week. Home video allowed time shifting. The internet eventually provided on-demand access to more animated content than anyone could ever watch. The Saturday morning time slot lost its specialness, its unique hold on children's attention and imagination. Networks began filling the hours with other programming, educational shows to satisfy regulatory requirements, or simply infomercials when they could find nothing else profitable to broadcast. By the early 2000s, Saturday morning cartoons in their classic form had essentially vanished from network television. A few shows lingered, a few networks maintained abbreviated blocks, but the era had ended. The ritual had dissolved. Children still watched cartoons, perhaps more than ever, but they watched them on their own schedules, on their own devices, in their own rooms. The communal experience, the shared timing, the collective participation in a weekly ritual, all this had faded into memory. And yet, the memory persists. Adults who grew up during the golden age of Saturday morning cartoons carry those experiences with them, remember the shows and characters, can still sing the theme songs, still recall the feeling of those mornings, the specific quality of attention they brought to watching, the way time seemed to work differently, how the hours stretched out luxuriously, filled with color and sound and story. These memories have become part of cultural heritage, something passed down not through continued practice, but through nostalgia and recollection, through streaming services that offer vintage cartoons, through revival shows that attempt to recapture the magic, through parents sharing with children what Saturday mornings once meant, even though the experience itself can never be fully recreated, because it depended on context, on scarcity, on the specific technological and cultural conditions of its time. The legacy lives on in other ways, in the storytelling techniques absorbed by children who became writers and directors, in the character types and narrative structures that still appear in contemporary animation, in the understanding that cartoons can be more than mere distraction, that they can teach and inspire and create lasting bonds, that animation is a legitimate art form worthy of serious attention and creative ambition, and somewhere, in some part of memory, Saturday morning cartoons continue, existing outside time in a perpetual loop of reruns that never end, where Scooby and Shaggy are forever running from monsters, where Bugs is forever outwitting Elmer, where the Super Friends are forever assembling to save the world, where children are forever waking early, forever claiming the television, forever experiencing that particular magic that belonged to Saturday mornings and to Saturday mornings alone. The screen glows softly, even now, in memory, casting its gentle light across years and decades, illuminating something precious that once existed, a ritual of childhood, a weekly gathering around stories told in pictures and sound, a time when the world was simple enough to fit inside a television screen, and Saturday mornings lasted forever. I stand now in a quiet place, a place where marble columns once rose toward an impossibly blue sky, where footsteps echoed on stone worn smooth by countless sandaled feet, and where voices, urgent, questioning, endlessly curious, filled the air with ideas that would ripple forward through millennia. The light here is golden and slanting, the kind of light that comes in late afternoon when the sun hangs low over distant hills, casting everything in amber and honey, softening the edges of the world until even the hardest stone seems to glow from within. I can almost see them, these figures in simple robes, walking beneath colonnades, sitting in the shade of olive trees, their hands moving as they speak, gesturing toward the heavens, or tracing invisible diagrams in the dust at their feet. Men who devoted their lives not to conquest or commerce, but to something far more elusive, the pursuit of a wisdom, the examination of existence itself. This is ancient Greece, a world of city-states perched on rocky peninsulas, of harbors filled with trading vessels, of amphitheaters carved into hillsides, and of agoras, those bustling public squares where citizens gathered to debate and discuss, to buy and sell, to argue and learn, but more than any marketplace or monument, more than any temple or theater. What defined this world was the presence of philosophers, thinkers who looked at the same sun and sea and stars that everyone else saw, and asked different questions, not how to navigate by the stars, but what the stars were made of, not how to appease the gods, but whether the gods existed at all, not how to live a successful life, but what success truly meant, what goodness was, what justice required, what reality itself consisted of. These questions seem almost unbearably large, the kind of inquiries that could consume a lifetime. And, indeed, they did, generation after generation of brilliant minds returning to the same fundamental puzzles, refining them, expanding them, building elaborate systems of thought that still echo in every philosophy classroom, every ethics debate, every moment when someone pauses and wonders about the nature of truth. I imagine the air itself in those days, dry and warm, carrying the scent of thyme and rosemary from the hillsides, the salt tang of the Aegean, the smell of olive oil and wine and bread, and underneath it all, the particular atmosphere of concentrated thought, of minds engaged in the most demanding work humans can undertake, the work of thinking clearly, of questioning assumptions, of following logic wherever it might lead. The philosophers walked these streets and paths, some wealthy and well-connected, others poor and peculiar, some surrounded by eager students, others wandering alone, but all united by this strange compulsion to understand, to examine, to question everything that others simply accepted. They gathered in gymnasiums and gardens, in porticos and private homes, wherever there was space to sit and talk, to think aloud, to test ideas against the sharp edges of dialectic, that method of question and answer, of proposal and counter-proposal, of slowly building toward truth through conversation. I can almost hear the rhythm of those dialogues, the back and forth, the moment when someone raises an objection, the pause as the other considers, the new formulation that emerges, slightly different, more precise, closer to something essential. This world of ancient Greek philosophy spans centuries, from the earliest pre-Socratic thinkers who looked at the natural world and wondered about its fundamental substance, through the golden age of classical Athens, and forward into the Hellenistic period when Greek thought spread across the Mediterranean and beyond, influencing every culture it touched. And throughout all those years, Through all those different schools and systems and approaches, there runs a common thread, the belief that human reason could penetrate the mysteries of existence, that careful thought and honest inquiry could lead to genuine understanding, that wisdom was attainable if one was willing to dedicate oneself entirely to its pursuit. So I begin, as I see here, in this luminous space between history and imagination, ready to walk among these ancient thinkers, to visit their schools and their debates, to trace the evolution of their ideas, to see how questions asked more than 2,000 years ago continue to shape the way we think about everything that matters. The columns stand in rows, their shadows lengthening across marble and stone, and somewhere in the distance, the murmur of voices engaged in eternal conversation. The story begins on the edges, in the coastal cities of Ionia, where Greek-speaking colonists had established prosperous settlements along what is now the western coast of Turkey. Places like Miletus and Ephesus, cities that looked outward toward the sea, toward trade routes and foreign ideas, toward Egypt and Babylon and Persia. It was here, in the 6th century before the Common Era, that something remarkable began to happen, a new way of thinking about the world, one that would break away from purely mythological explanations and seek instead natural causes, rational principles, underlying patterns that could be discovered through observation and thought. The earliest of these thinkers is Thales of Miletus, a man who lived around 600 years before the Common Era, a merchant and mathematician who traveled widely, who predicted a solar eclipse, who measured the height of pyramids by their shadows, and who asked a question that seems simple but was revolutionary: what is everything made of? Before Thales, the answer would have involved gods and creation myths, stories of divine beings shaping the world from chaos. But Thales proposed something different. He suggested that all things, despite their apparent diversity, arose from a single substance, and he believed that substance was water. Water, which flows and freezes and evaporates, which takes countless forms, which is essential to all living things, which covers most of the earth. Perhaps water was the fundamental reality, and everything else merely transformations of this one primal element. We might smile at this conclusion now, but the question itself was extraordinary. The idea that beneath the multiplicity of appearances there might be a unity, a single principle from which everything derived. This was the beginning of philosophy, the attempt to find rational explanations for the nature of reality. Thales had students and successors, other thinkers in Miletus who took up his project but proposed different answers. Anaximander, who lived just after Thales, suggested that the fundamental substance was not water, but something he called the apeiron, the boundless or indefinite, something infinite and undefined from which all determinate things emerged. Anaximander created one of the first models of the cosmos, imagining the earth as a cylinder floating in space, surrounded by wheels of fire, glimpsed through openings that appeared as sun and moon and stars. He thought about how life might have originated, suggesting that humans must have descended from fish, an astonishing intuition of evolutionary thinking thousands of years before Darwin. Then came Anaximenes, the third great Milesian thinker, who proposed that air was the fundamental substance, air which could be rarefied into fire or condensed into wind and cloud and water and finally earth, a theory that tried to explain how the one could become the many through processes of expansion and compression. These Milesian philosophers, these first hesitant steps toward rational inquiry, were attempting something humans had never quite done before. They were trying to understand the world without appealing to divine intervention, to find natural explanations, to discover principles that operated consistently and could be understood through reason. And while they disagreed about the answers, the very fact that they were asking these questions, that they were proposing theories and debating them, created a new intellectual culture, one where ideas were tested against observation and logic rather than simply accepted on authority. Further south, on the island of Samos, and later in the Greek colonies of southern Italy, another kind of inquiry was developing. Here Pythagoras founded not just a school of thought, but something like a religious community, a brotherhood dedicated to the study of mathematics and music, bound by strict rules and secret teachings. Pythagoras, who may have lived from around 570 to 490 before the Common Era, believed that number was the fundamental reality, that mathematical relationships governed everything from the movements of celestial bodies to the harmonies of musical strings, that the cosmos itself was ordered according to numerical principles. The Pythagoreans discovered the mathematical ratios that produce harmonious musical intervals. They explored the properties of triangles and developed geometric proofs. They believed in the transmigration of souls, in reincarnation, and they lived according to various prohibitions and practices that seem mysterious to us now, avoiding beans, maintaining periods of silence, studying the properties of sacred shapes. For them, mathematics was not merely a tool, but a window into ultimate truth. Numbers revealed the hidden structure of reality, and through understanding numerical relationships, one could achieve not just knowledge, but purification, a spiritual ascent. Pythagoras left no writings, and much of what we know about him is entangled with legend, but his influence spread through southern Italy and Sicily, creating a tradition of mathematical mysticism that would profoundly shape later philosophy, especially Plato's belief in eternal forms and mathematical ideals. Meanwhile, in Ephesus, a city known for its great temple to Artemis, there lived a philosopher of an entirely different temperament, Heraclitus, who wrote in paradoxes and riddles, who was known as the Obscure One, the dark philosopher, because his sayings were so cryptic and challenging. Heraclitus, who flourished around 500 before the Common Era, saw reality as fundamentally characterized by change and conflict. Everything flows, he said. You cannot step twice into the same river, for fresh waters are ever flowing in upon you. The universe for Heraclitus was not static but dynamic, composed of opposites in tension, hot and cold, wet and dry, life and death, and it was precisely this tension, this strife between opposites, that generated everything. War is the father of all things, he proclaimed, not celebrating violence, but recognizing that existence itself arose from opposition and change. Yet beneath all of this flux, Heraclitus believed there was a logos, a rational principle, a kind of cosmic reason that governed the patterns of change, the way fire transforms wood into smoke and ash, the way day gives way to night and night to day. These transformations followed a hidden harmony, an order that most people failed to perceive. Fire was Heraclitus's symbol for this ever-living process, fire that consumes and transforms, that is never the same from moment to moment. yet maintains its character as fire, an image of unity in multiplicity, permanence in change. His philosophy was challenging, even disturbing boredom, because it denied the solidity of things. It suggested that what we take to be stable and enduring is actually in constant flux. That identity itself is a kind of illusion, or at least something far more complex than it appears. In stark contrast, in the Greek colonies of southern Italy, Parmenides of Elea proposed a philosophy that denied change entirely. He argued through a long and difficult poem that true being must be eternal, unchanging, indivisible, complete. Parmenides, who lived in the early 5th century before the Common Era, used rigorous logical argument to demonstrate that change and multiplicity were impossible, that they violated the basic principles of thought. Whatever is, and whatever is not, and there is no middle ground, no becoming, no coming to be or passing away. The world of change and diversity that we perceive through our senses, according to Parmenides, is an illusion, the way of seeming rather than the way of truth. Reality is one eternal, unchanging, and any philosophy that took change seriously was fundamentally mistaken. This was an audacious claim, and it created a profound problem for all subsequent philosophy. How could one account for the evident fact of change while respecting Parmenides' logical arguments? How could multiplicity be real if being was truly one? Parmenides had a brilliant student named Zeno, who defended his teacher's philosophy by developing a series of paradoxes designed to show that motion and change led to logical contradictions. The famous paradox of Achilles and the tortoise, the paradox of the arrow. Arguments so clever and troubling that philosophers would grapple with them for centuries. These early thinkers, scattered across the Greek world from Ionia to Italy, were creating the fundamental questions and problems that would occupy philosophy for its entire history. What is reality made of? Is it one or many? Does it change or remain eternally the same? Can we trust our senses or only our reason? What is the relationship between appearance and reality? And then, in the mid-5th century before the Common Era, the focus shifted. Athens, which had emerged as the greatest power in Greece after the Persian Wars, became the center of intellectual life. Drawing thinkers from across the Greek world into this vibrant city came the Sophists, professional teachers who traveled from city to city, offering instruction in rhetoric, persuasion, the arts of successful public speaking, essential skills in a democracy where political life depended on one's ability to argue effectively in the assembly and the courts. The Sophists were controversial figures. Some of them, like Protagoras, were serious intellectuals who thought deeply about ethics and epistemology. Protagoras declared that man is the measure of all things, suggesting a kind of relativism, that truth and value were human constructs, dependent on individual or cultural perspective. Others, like Gorgias, dazzled audiences with displays of rhetorical virtuosity, arguing brilliantly on any side of any question, demonstrating that persuasion was an art independent of truth. That language could be used to make the weaker argument appear stronger. This emphasis on rhetoric and persuasion, on winning arguments rather than discovering truth, troubled many Athenians. It seemed to undermine traditional values, to suggest that justice and virtue were merely matters of convention, that there was no objective right and wrong, only clever manipulation of opinion, and it was against this backdrop, in response to both the natural philosophers who studied the cosmos and the sophists who studied human affairs, that the most famous period of Greek philosophy would emerge, centered on three extraordinary figures, Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, who would transform philosophy from scattered inquiry into systematic discipline. But before we reach them, we must linger here a moment longer in this earlier world of bold speculation and radical questioning, where philosophy was still young, still finding its methods, still discovering what questions mattered most. The sun continues its arc across that ancient sky. The shadows lengthen and shift, and the conversations continue. Voices rising and falling, questions multiplying, the great adventure of human thought gathering momentum. The streets of Athens in the late 5th century before the Common Era were narrow and winding, crowded with merchants and craftsmen, with citizens arguing politics and foreigners seeking fortune, the air thick with dust and noise and the particular energy of a city at the height of its power. And somewhere in that bustle, moving through the agora, stopping to talk with anyone who would engage him, was a peculiar figure, barefoot and snub-nosed, with a pot-belly and a face like a satyr, a man who claimed to know nothing, who spent his days asking questions, who would become the most influential philosopher who ever lived, despite never writing a single word. Socrates, born around 470 before the Common Era, was the son of a stonemason and a midwife, and he would describe his own method as a kind of midwifery, helping others give birth to ideas that were already within them. Drawing out knowledge through careful questioning, he would approach someone in the marketplace, often someone with a reputation for wisdom or expertise, and ask them to define some concept they claimed to understand. What is courage? What is justice? What is piety? What is knowledge itself? And the person would offer a definition, confident at first, but Socrates would probe gently, asking for clarification, proposing counterexamples, showing contradictions, and gradually the definition would unravel, revealing that what seemed clear and certain was actually confused and uncertain. This became known as the Socratic method, this relentless questioning, this refusal to accept easy answers, and it made Socrates both beloved and hated, beloved by young men who followed him around the city, delighted to watch him deflate the pretensions of their elders, hated by those same elders who found themselves publicly humiliated, exposed as not knowing what they claimed to know. But Socrates insisted he was performing a service. The unexamined life is not worth living, he proclaimed, and most people lived unexamined lives, accepting conventional beliefs without question, confusing opinion with knowledge, never bothering to think carefully about the most important matters, how to live, what to value, what it meant to be good. He had a divine mission, he said, given to him by the oracle at Delphi. The priestess there had declared that no one was wiser than Socrates, and he had set out to prove the oracle wrong, searching for someone genuinely wise, only to discover that while others thought they knew things they did not know, he at least knew that he knew nothing, and this awareness of his own ignorance was a kind of wisdom. Socrates fought in the Peloponnesian War, the long, devastating conflict between Athens and Sparta. He served with distinction as a hoplite soldier, showing physical courage, but his greater courage was intellectual and moral. His willingness to follow argument wherever it led, to stand up to political pressure, to remain true to his principles even when it cost him everything. He believed that virtue was knowledge, that no one did wrong willingly, that if you truly understood what was good, you would inevitably do it. This seemed paradoxical, but Socrates argued that when people acted badly, it was always because they were confused, mistaking what merely seemed good for what truly was good, chasing pleasure or wealth or power while losing sight of the genuine well-being of their souls. The soul, psyche in Greek, was Socrates' great concern, and not the body with its appetites and vulnerabilities, but the inner self, the rational and moral core of a person. And caring for the soul meant pursuing wisdom and virtue, meant examining oneself constantly, meant valuing truth over reputation, justice over success. His conversations often ended in aporia, a state of puzzlement, with no clear answer reached, but this was not failure, it was progress. Better to recognize one's ignorance than to remain trapped in false certainty. Better to keep questioning than to accept comfortable delusions. For decades, Socrates wandered Athens asking his questions, never charging fees like the sophists, living in poverty, wearing the same worn cloak year-round, subsisting on simple food, his needs minimal, because his focus was entirely on the life of the mind, on philosophy as a way of being rather than merely a subject to study. But Athens was changing. The long war with Sparta had ended in humiliating defeat. Democracy had been briefly overthrown by oligarchy, then restored. The city was traumatized and angry, looking for someone to blame. And Socrates, with his constant questioning, his association with men who had betrayed Athens, his habit of making prominent citizens look foolish, became a target. In 399 before the Common Era, when Socrates was 70 years old, he was brought to trial, charged with impiety, with failing to recognize the gods of the city and introducing new divinities, and with corrupting the youth, teaching them to question authority and tradition. The trial took place before a jury of 500 Athenian citizens, and Socrates defended himself, not by appealing to pity or making compromises, but by reaffirming everything he had always stood for. He would not stop philosophizing. He would not abandon his divine mission. He would rather die than live without examining life and pursuing truth. The jury found him guilty by a narrow margin, and according to Athenian law, both prosecution and defense could propose a penalty. The prosecution proposed death, and Socrates, in what might have been irony or genuine conviction, suggested that instead of punishment, he deserved to be maintained at public expense in the Prytaneum, the honor given to Olympic victors, because he had spent his life benefiting the city through philosophy. The jury was not amused and voted for death by an even larger margin. Socrates would drink hemlock, a poison that would gradually paralyze his body until it stopped his breathing and his heart. He spent his final days in prison, surrounded by friends and students, continuing to do what he had always done, talking about philosophy, examining questions about death and immortality and the nature of the soul, remaining cheerful and unafraid, insisting that a good person cannot be harmed, that nothing bad can happen to someone who has lived virtuously. On the day of his execution, he bathed and said farewell to his family, then drank the hemlock calmly, walking around until his legs grew heavy. then lying down as the numbness spread upward through his body. His final words were to remind his friend Crito that they owed a rooster to Asclepius, the god of healing, perhaps suggesting that death was a cure, a release of the soul from the body. And with Socrates' death, philosophy became something more than scattered inquiry. It became a way of life demanding total commitment, a calling that might require the ultimate sacrifice, and it inspired one of his devoted followers to ensure that Socrates' voice would never be silenced. That follower was Plato, born into an aristocratic Athenian family around 427 before the Common Era, a young man who might have pursued politics or poetry, but who encountered Socrates and devoted his life to philosophy instead. Plato was devastated by his teacher's execution. He left Athens for a time, traveling to Italy and Sicily, studying with the Pythagoreans, learning mathematics and geometry, absorbing their belief that abstract mathematical forms represented a higher reality than the physical world of flux and change. When he returned to Athens, around 387 before the Common Era, Plato founded a school in a grove sacred to the hero Academus, the Academy, which would continue for nearly 900 years, becoming the model for all later universities, a place dedicated entirely to the pursuit of knowledge through dialogue and inquiry. And Plato began to write, creating a series of dialogues, philosophical dramas, in which Socrates appeared as the main character, questioning and probing and examining. These dialogues preserved not just Socrates' method, but something of his personality, his irony and humor, his ability to puncture pretension, his relentless pursuit of truth. The early dialogues likely represent the historical Socrates fairly closely. Works like the Euthyphro, where Socrates questions a religious expert about the nature of piety, or the Apology, which presents Socrates' defense speech at his trial, or the Crito, where he explains why he will not escape from prison even when given the chance. But gradually, the dialogues became vehicles for Plato's own philosophy. Socrates, the character, began expressing views that went far beyond anything the historical Socrates likely believed. And Plato developed a comprehensive system that addressed not just ethics, but metaphysics, epistemology, politics, aesthetics, cosmology. At the heart of Plato's philosophy was the theory of forms, the idea that the physical world we perceive through our senses is not the most real world, that it is actually a kind of shadow or reflection of a higher realm of perfect eternal forms or ideas. Consider a circle drawn in the sand. It is never perfectly round. It has thickness and irregularity. It will be washed away by the tide. But the form of circle, the pure mathematical ideal, is eternal and perfect. It exists not in space and time, but in a transcendent realm accessible only to thought. And this was true not just of mathematical objects, but of everything. There was a form of beauty itself, of justice itself, of the good itself, and particular beautiful things, or just actions participated in or imitated these eternal forms. They were beautiful, or just to the extent that they resembled the perfect, unchanging archetypes. This solved the problem posed by Heraclitus and Parmenides. The physical world could change and flux just as Heraclitus said, but the forms were eternal and unchanging, just as Parmenides insisted. And true knowledge was not of the changing physical world, but of the unchanging forms. Plato illustrated this with his famous allegory of the cave. Imagine prisoners chained in a cave from childhood, facing a wall. behind them a fire burns, and between the fire and the prisoners. People carry objects that cast shadows on the wall. The prisoners see only these shadows and take them for reality. But if a prisoner were freed and turned around, he would see the fire and the objects themselves and realize the shadows were mere reflections. And if he were dragged out of the cave into the sunlight, he would at first be blinded, but gradually his eyes would adjust, and he would see the real world, trees and mountains, and finally the sun itself, the source of all light and life. This, Plato said, was the journey of the philosopher, from the shadows of opinion and sense perception, up through mathematics and dialectic, to direct apprehension of the forms, and ultimately to knowledge of the form of the good, which illuminated all other knowledge just as the sun illuminated the physical world. Education then was not putting knowledge into empty minds, but turning the soul around, redirecting it from the shadows toward reality. And those who made this journey, the philosophers, were the only ones fit to rule, because only they understood what was truly good, what policies would create genuine justice and happiness rather than merely appearing to do so. In the Republic, Plato's longest and most influential dialogue, he designed an ideal city ruled by philosopher kings, where children were raised communally, where private property was abolished for the ruling class, where poets were banished for telling lies about the gods, a utopia that many readers find simultaneously inspiring and totalitarian. But Plato was not just theorizing. He tried 3 times to put his ideas into practice in Syracuse, a Greek city in Sicily, attempting to educate the young tyrant Dionysius the Younger, to turn him into a philosopher king, and 3 times it ended in failure and danger, Plato barely escaping with his life. Still, back in Athens, the academy flourished. Students came from across the Greek world, and among them, arriving at age 17 or 18, was a young man from Stagira in northern Greece, the son of a physician, brilliant and ambitious and destined to become even more influential than his teacher. His name was Aristotle, and he would study at the academy for 20 years, until Plato's death, absorbing everything, questioning everything, and eventually developing a philosophy that departed from Plato's in fundamental ways, bringing philosophy down from the transcendent realm of forms and back to the physical world of nature and change. Aristotle was born in 384 before the Common Era in Stagira, a small town on the northern coast of the Aegean, far from the cultural center of Athens. His father Nicomachus was court physician to the king of Macedon, and this connection would shape Aristotle's life in unexpected ways. When he arrived at Plato's academy as a teenager, Aristotle was brilliant but also stubborn, willing to challenge his teacher. Plato supposedly called him the foal because, like a young horse, he was always kicking against the very one who nourished him. But this intellectual independence was precisely what would make Aristotle great. For 20 years he studied and taught at the academy, absorbing Plato's philosophy while developing doubts about it. And when Plato died in 347 before the Common Era, Aristotle left Athens, perhaps disappointed at not being chosen to lead the academy, perhaps simply ready to pursue his own path. He traveled to Asia Minor, to the island of Lesbos, studying marine biology, collecting specimens, examining the structure and behavior of sea creatures with meticulous care, and this empirical investigation of nature, this attention to particular facts and details, would become central to his philosophical method. Then came an extraordinary opportunity. Philip of Macedon, the king who was transforming his backward kingdom into a military superpower, invited Aristotle to tutor his 13-year-old son, Alexander. And for several years, Aristotle taught the boy who would become Alexander the Great, instructing him in Homer and Greek literature, in ethics and politics, though what influence this philosophical education had on Alexander's later career of conquest remains unclear. When Alexander ascended to the throne and began his campaigns, Aristotle returned to Athens, now in his 50s, and founded his own school, the Lyceum, named for the grove of Apollolykios, where it was located. Here he would walk along covered walkways while lecturing, and his followers became known as the Peripatetics, the walkers, at the Lyceum. Aristotle created something unprecedented. A research institution, he and his students collected information on an astonishing range of subjects. The constitutions of 158 Greek city-states, biological observations of hundreds of animal species, astronomical data, ethical case studies, literary analysis. They were attempting nothing less than to organize and understand all human knowledge. And Aristotle wrote, "Though what we have are not polished dialogues like Plato's, but lecture notes, treatises, working documents full of technical terminology and careful distinctions, texts that were studied and commented on for 2,000 years, that would dominate medieval philosophy and shape the development of science, where Plato had looked to an eternal realm of forms beyond the physical world." Aristotle insisted that the forms were in the things themselves, embedded in matter. There was no separate form of tree, but rather the form or essence of treeness existed in each individual tree, making it what it was. Everything in nature, Aristotle argued, had four causes: the material cause, what it was made of; the formal cause, what made it the kind of thing it was; the efficient cause, what brought it into being; and the final cause, what purpose or goal it served. And understanding anything meant grasping all four causes. This teleological view, this idea that natural things had inherent purposes, shaped his entire philosophy. An acorn had the potential to become an oak, and it actualized that potential by growing. Change was not random flux, but development toward natural ends, everything striving to fulfill its nature. For human beings, the key question was what our natural end or function was. And Aristotle's answer was eudaimonia, often translated as happiness, but really meaning flourishing or living well, the full realization of human potential. And this came through virtue, through excellent functioning according to reason, which was the distinctive human capacity. Virtue itself was not knowledge, as Socrates had claimed, but habit. We become virtuous by practicing virtuous actions, by finding the mean between extremes. Courage was the mean between cowardice and recklessness, generosity between stinginess and wastefulness. And this required practical wisdom, phronesis, the ability to perceive what action a situation called for. The highest human activity, Aristotle believed, was contemplation, theoretical study pursued for its own sake. This most resembled the activity of God, the unmoved mover who thought only about thinking, who set the cosmos in motion not through active intervention, but by being the object of love and desire toward which all things moved. In politics, Aristotle rejected Plato's ideal republic. He studied actual constitutions, analyzed what worked and what failed, concluded that the best realistic government was a mixed constitution balancing elements of monarchy, aristocracy, and democracy, with a large middle class providing stability, and he defended private property and the family against Plato's communalism. His influence was immediate and enduring. The Lyceum became a center of research and learning, but Aristotle's life ended in shadow. When Alexander died suddenly in 323 before the Common Era, anti-Macedonian sentiments swept Athens, and Aristotle, associated with the Macedonian court, was charged with impiety, the same charge that had killed Socrates. He fled to Chalcis, saying he would not allow Athens to sin twice against philosophy, and died there a year later, at 62, from a digestive illness. His will carefully provided for his household, freed his slaves, and arranged for his daughter's marriage, the practical concerns of a man who believed in living well in this world. After Aristotle, philosophy entered a new phase, the Hellenistic period, as Alexander's conquest spread Greek culture across the Mediterranean and into Asia, creating a cosmopolitan world where the old city-state loyalties seemed parochial, where individuals felt adrift in vast kingdoms, where the urgent question was not how to be a good citizen, but how to achieve personal tranquility in uncertain times. New schools emerged. Epicurus founded a garden school in Athens around 300 before the Common Era, teaching that pleasure was the highest good, though by pleasure he meant not wild indulgence, but the absence of pain and disturbance, ataraxia, tranquility, achieved through simple living, friendship, and the study of philosophy. The Epicureans believed the gods existed but did not intervene in human affairs, that the soul was material and dissolved at death, that there was therefore nothing to fear, no divine punishment, no afterlife, just the finite span of life to be lived as pleasantly and peacefully as possible. And this required overcoming irrational fears and unnecessary desires. Meanwhile, Zeno of Citium, who had come to Athens as a merchant and stayed to study philosophy, founded the Stoic school around the same time, teaching in the Stoa Poikile, the painted colonnade from which his followers took their name. The Stoics believed in living according to nature, accepting whatever happened as the working of divine providence, a rational cosmic order that determined all events. Human freedom consisted not in controlling external circumstances, which was impossible, but in controlling one's own judgments and responses. Virtue alone was sufficient for happiness. The Stoics insisted everything else, health, wealth, reputation, family, were merely preferred indifference, nice to have, but ultimately irrelevant to true well-being. What mattered was maintaining proper judgment, not being disturbed by misfortune, accepting one's fate with equanimity. This philosophy would prove enormously influential, spreading throughout the Roman world, adopted by slaves like Epictetus and emperors like Marcus Aurelius, providing consolation and strength through times of persecution and chaos, teaching that inner freedom was inviolable even when outer freedom was lost. A third Hellenistic school, the Skeptics, took uncertainty itself as their theme. arguing that for every argument there was an equally strong counter-argument, that we should suspend judgment on all matters, achieving ataraxia through the recognition that nothing could be known for certain. They were descendants of Socrates in a way, taking his profession of ignorance to its logical extreme. These Hellenistic philosophies were less systematic than Plato and Aristotle, more focused on practical ethics than metaphysics. They offered not grand theories of reality, but recipes for living, techniques for achieving peace of mind, and they attracted followers across the Mediterranean world, adapting to different cultures, blending with local traditions. Greek philosophy also encountered other traditions. In Alexandria, the great library and museum became centers of learning where Greek thought mixed with Egyptian and Jewish ideas. Philo of Alexandria, a Jewish philosopher in the 1st century of the Common Era, tried to reconcile Plato with Scripture, reading the Hebrew Bible allegorically, finding Greek metaphysics in the book of Genesis, and as Rome absorbed the Greek world politically, it absorbed Greek philosophy intellectually. Educated Romans studied in Athens, read Plato and Aristotle, adopted Stoicism as particularly suited to their martial temperament. Cicero translated philosophical terms into Latin, making Greek thought accessible to a new audience. The final great ancient philosopher was Plotinus, who lived in the 3rd century of the Common Era, in a Roman Empire besieged by barbarians and racked by crisis. He developed Neoplatonism, a mystical interpretation of Plato that saw reality as emanating from the One, an ineffable source beyond being, flowing down through levels of decreasing unity and reality, nous or intellect, psyche or soul, and finally matter. The goal of philosophy for Plotinus was henosis, union with the One, achieved through contemplation and ascetic practice, turning away from the material world, ascending through the levels of reality until the soul merged with its source, and Plotinus claimed to have achieved this mystical union several times in his life. His student Porphyry collected his writings into the Enneads, and this late flowering of Greek philosophy would profoundly influence early Christian theology, providing concepts and vocabulary for articulating the relationship between God and creation, between the divine and human natures of Christ, between time and eternity. When the Emperor Justinian closed the philosophical schools of Athens in 529 of the Common Era, including Plato's Academy, which had survived for 900 years, it marked the end of ancient philosophy as a living tradition, but not the end of its influence, which had already spread far beyond Greece, into Christian Europe, into the Islamic world, into every culture that encountered the texts and questions these ancient thinkers had left behind. The voices have grown quieter now. The colonnades stand empty. The gardens where Epicurus taught are long overgrown, but the questions remain, hovering in the air like late afternoon light, questions about the nature of reality and the meaning of virtue, about how to live and what to value, about the relationship between knowledge and happiness, between reason and faith, between the individual and society. These ancient philosophers, with their simple robes and their endless conversations, created something that would never die, not a set of fixed doctrines, but a way of thinking, a commitment to following arguments wherever they led, to examining life rather than simply living it, to seeking wisdom even knowing it might forever elude our grasp. And so we find ourselves standing in this quiet space between antiquity and imagination, where the distant past feels strangely present, where questions asked more than 2 millennia ago still echo with unsettling relevance. What did these philosophers give us? These men who walked dusty paths and argued in marketplaces, who chose poverty and inquiry over comfort and certainty, who believed that thinking carefully about existence was the most important thing a human being could do. They gave us, first of all, the very idea that reality might be understood through reason, that beneath the chaos of appearances there might be order, patterns, principles discoverable through careful thought. This was not obvious. Most human cultures had explained the world through myth and tradition, through stories of gods and heroes, through received wisdom never meant to be questioned. But the Greeks dared to question, to propose natural explanations, to test ideas against logic and observation, and in doing so they created science, philosophy, critical thinking itself, the foundation of every intellectual discipline that followed. They gave us ethics as systematic inquiry. Before Socrates, people knew how to act. They followed customs and conventions. They honored the gods and obeyed their parents. But they did not ask why, did not examine the principles underlying right action, did not wonder whether conventional morality might be mistaken. Socrates made ethics philosophical, turned it into a subject requiring careful analysis, and his successors developed competing theories: virtue ethics focusing on character, Stoic ethics emphasizing acceptance, Epicurean ethics pursuing tranquility, each offering a different vision of human flourishing, each still debated today in slightly different vocabulary, but essentially unchanged questions. They gave us political philosophy, the attempt to think rationally about justice, about what made governments legitimate, about the relationship between individual freedom and collective welfare. Plato's Republic and Aristotle's Politics established frameworks that every subsequent political thinker would either build upon or react against. The idea that rulers should be wise rather than merely powerful, that laws should serve justice rather than simply express the will of the strong, that political arrangements could be evaluated and improved through reason. These were revolutionary concepts, and they planted seeds that would eventually grow into democracy, human rights, constitutional government. They gave us logic, the formal study of correct reasoning. Aristotle systematized the syllogism, analyzed fallacies, created tools for distinguishing valid from invalid arguments, and later Greek logicians like Chrysippus developed propositional logic, the foundation of mathematics and computer science, ways of thinking that would prove essential to every form of rigorous inquiry. They gave us wonder, that peculiar state of mind where curiosity overwhelms certainty, where questions become more valuable than answers. Aristotle said that philosophy begins in wonder, and the best Greek philosophers maintained that sense of astonishment throughout their lives, never lost the capacity to be amazed by existence, by the fact that there is something rather than nothing, that the cosmos is ordered rather than chaotic, that consciousness emerged from matter and can contemplate its own origins. This wonder was not mystical but rational, not passive but active. It demanded investigation, explanation, understanding, yet it also recognized limits, knew that some mysteries might prove impenetrable, that human reason, powerful as it was, might never grasp ultimate reality. And this combination of confidence and humility, of ambition and modesty, characterized the best Greek philosophy. They gave us models of philosophical lives, Socrates facing death with courage, Diogenes living in a barrel and mocking convention, Epicurus cultivating friendship in his garden, Epictetus maintaining dignity in slavery, Marcus Aurelius seeking wisdom on the battlefield. These were not just thinkers, but exemplars, showing that philosophy was not academic abstraction, but a way of being in the world. The philosophical life required sacrifice. It meant valuing truth over popularity, wisdom over wealth, integrity over success. It meant accepting that most people would not understand, that you might be mocked or persecuted, that you might die for your principles as Socrates did, yet it offered something invaluable in return: the examined life, the life lived consciously, with awareness and purpose, and perhaps most profoundly, they gave us ourselves, or at least a particular understanding of what it meant to be human. The Greek philosophers invented the concept of the autonomous, rational individual, the self-capable of questioning tradition, of making independent judgments, of taking responsibility for its own beliefs and actions. Before Greek philosophy, identity was primarily collective. You were a member of a tribe, a family, a city. Your role was defined by tradition and maintained through ritual. But Socrates insisted that each person must think for themselves, must examine their own lives, must take ownership of their souls. This emphasis on individual rationality and moral autonomy would become foundational to Western culture. For better and worse, it enabled scientific progress in human rights, but also alienation and rootlessness. It freed individuals from oppressive traditions, but also cut them off from sources of meaning and belonging. The Greek legacy is therefore complex, not simply a gift, but a challenge, an invitation to think, to question, to seek wisdom, but also a warning about the costs of such seeking, about how philosophical inquiry can destabilize certainties, can leave us uncertain and anxious, can reveal problems we cannot solve. Yet perhaps this uncertainty is itself valuable. Perhaps the questions matter more than the answers. Perhaps philosophy's greatest contribution is not any particular doctrine or system, but the practice itself, the ongoing conversation, the willingness to keep thinking, to keep examining, to never settle into dogmatic slumber. The light has grown softer now, that golden afternoon light deepening toward evening, the shadows stretching long across ancient stones. And in this gentle dimming there is something peaceful, something like acceptance. We cannot return to Athens in its glory, cannot sit at Socrates' feet or walk with Aristotle, cannot join the philosophical schools or debate in the agora. That world is gone, lost to time as completely as the sound of their voices, the texture of their actual daily lives. What remains are texts, fragments, commentaries upon commentaries, words preserved through centuries of copying and translation, sometimes distorted, sometimes clarified, always at a remove from the living thought that first produced them. And yet, when we read Plato's dialogues or Aristotle's treatises, when we encounter Socrates questioning, Epicurus counseling, Marcus Aurelius reflecting, something comes alive. Not the historical reality, perhaps, but something equally real. A meeting of minds across time, a conversation that death cannot end. The questions they asked are our questions still. What is justice? What is happiness? How should we live? What can we know? What is real? These are not ancient puzzles, but perennial human concerns, and their attempts at answers, however flawed or incomplete, still illuminate our own groping toward understanding. Philosophy continues in universities and coffee shops, in solitary thought and public debate, building on what the Greeks began, using their methods, refining their arguments, sometimes rejecting their conclusions, but always indebted to their example, to their audacious belief that human reason could make sense of existence. The stars are beginning to appear, one by one, in the deepening blue above, the same stars the Greeks saw, though they understood them differently, thought them fixed in crystalline spheres, divine and eternal. We know now they are distant suns, some already dead, their light still traveling toward us across impossible distances. But that difference in understanding does not diminish the wonder, does not make the stars less beautiful, and perhaps Greek philosophy is like that, its specific doctrines superseded, its cosmology outdated, its science primitive, yet its essential achievement untouched, the achievement of thinking, of questioning, of refusing to accept ignorance as fate. The air grows cool, the way it does as daylight fades, and there is something in this cooling, this gentle transition from light to darkness, that feels appropriate, like a natural conclusion, not an ending, but a passing, a giving way. The philosophers are gone, their voices silent, their footsteps no longer echo on marble, but what they made. This thing called philosophy, this practice of careful thinking, continues, changes, adapts, remains always vital, always necessary. And in some sense they are not gone. Not entirely, for whenever someone stops to think clearly about existence, to question assumptions, to examine life rather than simply living it, Socrates is there, Plato is there, Aristotle is there, all of them present in the act of philosophical inquiry itself. The last light lingers on the hilltops, reluctant to go, painting everything in shades of amber and rose. And then softly, gradually, it fades, leaving the world to darkness and to stars, to the quiet that comes after speaking, to the peace that follows questions, when we accept that some answers must wait, perhaps forever. Perhaps that too is wisdom, knowing when to rest, when to let go, when to simply be here, now, in this moment of fading light, this threshold between day and night, between knowing and unknowing, between the voice and the silence that follows. There is a quietness that settles over certain thoughts, a particular kind of stillness that comes when considering the hidden architecture of everything around us. And tonight, I find myself drawn into that contemplative space where the invisible becomes almost tangible, where the building blocks of existence reveal themselves not through noise or spectacle, but through patient observation and gentle wonder. Chemistry is everywhere, in the air moving through an open window, in the pages of an old book, in the glass that holds water, in the water itself, and yet it remains largely unseen, working its quiet transformations beneath the surface of our daily awareness. It is the language that matter uses to speak to itself, the grammar of atoms and molecules, the syntax of bonds forming and breaking in an endless, elegant conversation. I imagine a laboratory late in the evening, not the bright, bustling space of daytime work, but rather a place where shadows lengthen across wooden benches, where glass vessels catch the last amber light, where everything has settled into a profound hush. In such a space, one might sense the presence of something ancient and fundamental, the same forces that have been orchestrating the dance of particles since the universe began, still present, still active, still weaving their intricate patterns. The periodic table hangs on a wall somewhere in my mind's eye. That elegant arrangement of elements, each one a distinct character in the grand story of matter. Hydrogen, the simplest, the first, born in the heart of the universe itself. Carbon, the backbone of the life, the connector, the builder of infinite complexity. Oxygen, the breath, the burner, the partner in so many essential reactions. These are not mere abstractions, not just symbols in boxes arranged in rows. They are the fundamental vocabulary of existence, the letters from which every material thing is written. The iron in ancient meteorites and the iron in our blood share the same essential nature. The carbon in a diamond and the carbon in a pencil lead differ only in arrangement, in the pattern of their connections, in the geometry of their bonds. There is something deeply calming about this realization that beneath all the variety and complexity of the material world, beneath the countless forms and textures and colors, there exists a finite collection of elemental building blocks, 94 of them occurring naturally, each with its own character, its own way of interacting with others. And from this relatively small alphabet, the universe composes everything we see and touch and experience. Tonight, I find myself drawn into this realm not as a student facing an examination, not as someone seeking to master formulas or memorize reactions, but rather as someone standing at the edge of a vast, quiet ocean, content to observe the patterns in the waves, to notice how water moves, how light plays across its surface, how everything connects in subtle, beautiful ways. The story of chemistry is really the story of transformation, of how one thing becomes another through the rearrangement of atoms. It is the story of fire turning wood to ash and heat and light, of iron slowly joining with oxygen to form rust, of grapes fermenting into wine, of flour and water and yeast rising into bread. These transformations have accompanied humanity since our earliest days, and long before anyone understood the underlying mechanisms, people observed, experimented, and learned to work with these mysterious changes. There is an old alchemical symbol, a snake eating its own tail, representing cycles and transformation and the unity of all matter. The alchemists, those medieval and Renaissance seekers, were wrong about many things. They never succeeded in turning lead into gold, never found the universal elixir, and yet they were not entirely misguided. They understood intuitively that matter could be transformed, that hidden relationships existed between different substances, that patient observation and careful experiment could reveal profound truths. In many ways, they were the ancestors of modern chemistry, their smoky laboratories and cryptic manuscripts forming a bridge between ancient philosophy and systematic science. They developed techniques for distillation, for separation, for purification. They created specialized vessels and tools. They kept meticulous records, even if those records were sometimes obscured by mystical language and symbolic imagery. And underneath all their spiritual seeking and their quest for transmutation, they were engaging with something real and profound, the actual behavior of matter, the genuine transformations that occur when substances combine or separate, when heat is applied or removed, when solutions crystallize or vapors condense. I can almost smell the strange mixture of aromas that must have filled those old laboratories, the sulphurous tang, the sharp bite of acids, the sweet, heavy scent of certain metals, the acrid smoke of burning materials, each smell a clue, each observation a piece of a larger puzzle, slowly, over centuries, being assembled into something approaching understanding. But even now, even with our modern knowledge and sophisticated instruments, there remains something mysterious and wonderful about chemistry, something that invites quiet contemplation rather than mere memorization. It asks us to imagine scales we cannot directly perceive, to think about particles too small to see, about reactions happening in infinitesimal fractions of a second, about forces that hold atoms together with invisible yet powerful bonds. And so tonight, I invite myself deeper into this realm, not rushing, not straining, but allowing the story to unfold at its own pace, like a chemical reaction proceeding according to its own inherent timing, like a crystal slowly growing in a saturated solution, adding layer upon layer, building structure from solution, creating order from apparent chaos. The story begins long before there were laboratories or textbooks, long before anyone had conceived of atoms or elements in the way we understand them now. It begins with fire, with that first flame captured and tended, with humanity's earliest encounter with deliberate transformation. Imagine the scene. Tens of thousands of years ago, a group of people gathered around a fire, watching as wood, solid and substantial, becomes heat and light and smoke and a small pile of ash. The wood is gone, transformed into something else entirely. This must have seemed like magic, like a doorway into forces beyond ordinary comprehension, and in a sense, it was. Fire became humanity's first chemical laboratory. In its heat, clay hardened into pottery, giving people vessels to store and carry and cook. Certain rocks, when subjected to intense heat, yielded metals, copper first, gleaming and malleable, then bronze when copper was combined with tin, opening an entire era of human development. The people who discovered these processes didn't understand oxidation or reduction, didn't know about the rearrangement of atomic bonds, but they learned through patient trial and observation. They learned which ores yielded which metals, which temperatures were needed, which techniques produced the best results. This was chemistry, practical and empirical, passed down through generations as closely guarded knowledge. In the Nile Valley, the ancient Egyptians developed sophisticated chemical practices. They created pigments of stunning permanence, blues and greens and golds that still shine on tomb walls thousands of years later. They developed techniques for extracting and purifying metals, for making glass, for creating cosmetics and medicines, for the elaborate process of mummification. The word chemistry itself, some scholars believe, derives from the ancient Egyptian word for their land, chem or kemet, meaning black earth, the dark fertile soil left by the Nile's flooding. This connection feels appropriate, chemistry emerging from the earth, from the transformation of materials, from the patient work of hands, learning to shape and change the substances of the world. The Egyptians created natron, a mixture of sodium compounds, which they used in mummification and in glass making. They made faience, that brilliant blue-green glazed ceramic. They extracted oils and essences through primitive distillation. They ground minerals into powders, mixed compounds, observed reactions, all without understanding the underlying principles, yet achieving remarkable results through careful attention and accumulated experience. Meanwhile, in different parts of the world, other civilizations were conducting their own chemical explorations. In China, artisans were creating porcelain of extraordinary refinement, the right clay, the right temperature, the right glaze, all had to come together in precise harmony. They were also experimenting with what would eventually become gunpowder, mixing sulfur and charcoal and saltpeter, observing the dramatic reactions when these substances combined. The Chinese developed intricate processes for extracting metals from ores. They created bronze vessels of incredible artistry and technical sophistication. They fermented grains into alcohol, pickled vegetables, made vinegar. All of these processes involved chemical transformations, though the language to describe them would not exist for many centuries. In the ancient Mediterranean world, Greek philosophers began to ask fundamental questions about the nature of matter. What is everything made of? They wondered. What underlying substance or substances compose the vast variety of things we observe? Thales of Miletus, living around 600 years before the Common Era, proposed that water was the fundamental substance, the origin of all things. This seems quaint now, but it represented a crucial shift in thinking, an attempt to find unity beneath diversity, to identify fundamental principles rather than simply cataloging observations. Empedocles proposed that 4 elements, earth, water, air, and fire, combined in different proportions to create everything in the material world. These elements were thought to be moved by 2 forces, love, which brought them together, and strife, which drove them apart. It's a poetic framework mixing physics and metaphysics, but it represented an attempt to understand transformation and change. Democritus, whose name means chosen of the people, proposed something remarkably prescient. He suggested that if you kept dividing matter, cutting it into smaller and smaller pieces, you would eventually reach a point where no further division was possible. These ultimate particles he called atomos, meaning indivisible. He imagined these atoms as tiny, solid, eternal particles, differing in shape and size, and that the properties of different materials arose from the shapes and arrangements of their component atoms. This was an extraordinary insight, arrived at through pure reasoning rather than experiment. Democritus couldn't see atoms, couldn't prove their existence, but his intuition led him toward a truth that wouldn't be confirmed for more than 2,000 years. His contemporaries largely ignored or rejected his ideas, preferring the more elaborate and exoplanetary frameworks of other philosophers, and yet his vision of atoms moving through void, combining and separating, contained the seed of modern atomic theory. Aristotle, perhaps the most influential of ancient philosophers, modified and extended the 4-element theory, adding a 5th element, the quintessence or ether, thought to compose the heavenly bodies. He proposed that substances could transform from one to another through changes in their qualities: hot, cold, wet and dry, lead and gold. In this view were different combinations of the same fundamental matter, suggesting that transformation between them might be possible. This Aristotelian framework would dominate Western thought about matter for nearly 2,000 years. It was elegant, comprehensive and completely wrong in most of its specifics, and yet it served as a foundation for countless investigations and experiments. It gave people a language to discuss material change, a framework within which to organize observations. The practical arts continued to advance throughout the classical period and into the medieval era. Metallurgists refined their techniques, learning to work with iron, to create steel, to alloy different metals for different purposes. Glassmakers achieved new levels of clarity and color. Dyers discovered new ways to extract and fix colors from plants and minerals and certain sea creatures. The production of Tyrian purple, that royal color extracted from thousands of sea snails, represented both chemistry and economics. The process was complex, labor-intensive, and the result was a dye of exceptional quality and permanence. The exact mechanisms of how the chemical compounds in the snail's secretions bonded with fabric fibers was unknown, but the process worked, and that was sufficient. Fermentation remained mysterious and almost magical. Bread rising, grapes becoming wine, honey becoming mead, milk becoming cheese. These transformations happened in their own time, seemingly of their own accord, guided by invisible agents that wouldn't be identified as microorganisms for many more centuries. People developed elaborate rituals and precise methods, knowing that certain conditions favored successful fermentation while others led to spoilage. In the medieval Islamic world, chemistry advanced significantly through the work of scholars like Jabir ibn Hayyan, known in Latin as Geber, working in the 8th and 9th centuries. He emphasized careful experimentation and detailed observation. He described processes like distillation and sublimation with precision. He worked with various chemical substances, acids and alkalis, salts and metals. Jabir wrote extensively, though many works attributed to him may have been written by later scholars using his name. His texts described laboratory equipment and techniques, methods for purifying substances, procedures for combining materials. Much of his work was wrapped in symbolic and mystical language, following the tradition of keeping chemical knowledge hidden from the uninitiated. But beneath the symbolism lay genuine experimental work and practical knowledge. The development of distillation technology represented a major advance. The alembic, a specially designed vessel for separating substances by heating and condensing, allowed for the purification of liquids, the concentration of essences, the separation of alcohol from fermented beverages. In skilled hands, distillation could isolate specific components from complex mixtures, producing substances of unprecedented purity. Arabic scholars preserved and translated ancient Greek texts on natural philosophy, adding their own observations and innovations. They coined new terms, many of which have passed into modern chemistry: alcohol, alkali, elixir, alembic, all derived from Arabic. This linguistic legacy reflects the central role that Islamic scholars played in developing chemical knowledge during Europe's medieval period. The quest for the philosopher's stone became a central preoccupation of medieval and Renaissance alchemy. This legendary substance was imagined to have the power to transform base metals into gold, to create an elixir of life, to perfect matter itself. The search for it drove countless experiments, motivated scholars to spend years in their laboratories, mixing, heating, observing, recording. Was this search misguided? Perhaps, Gold cannot be made from lead through chemical means. Atoms of one element cannot be transformed into atoms of another element through the processes available to alchemists. And yet, the search itself generated real knowledge. Alchemists developed new equipment and techniques. They discovered new substances and documented their properties. They learned about acids and bases, about crystallization and precipitation, about the behavior of materials under different conditions. Paracelsus, working in the early 16th century, challenged many traditional alchemical and medical ideas. He emphasized the importance of chemistry for medicine, proposing that the body functioned through chemical processes and that diseases should be treated with chemical remedies rather than the traditional herbal preparations. He introduced the use of specific minerals and chemical compounds as medicines, mercury and antimony and sulfur compounds. His ideas were controversial and often overstated, but he helped shift alchemy toward a more medical and practical orientation. He insisted on the importance of experiment over authority, declaring that knowledge came from observation and testing rather than from ancient texts. This empirical emphasis, combined with his focus on practical applications, helped lay groundwork for chemistry's emergence as a distinct discipline. The alchemists worked in spaces filled with furnaces and vessels, retorts and crucibles. Their laboratories must have been extraordinary places, filled with strange smells and colored smokes, with substances bubbling and crystallizing, with the constant work of heating and cooling, mixing and separating. The knowledge they accumulated was often recorded in coded language and allegorical imagery, making it difficult for outsiders to understand. Yet within the alchemical community, this symbolic language conveyed real information about procedures and substances. Gradually, through the 17th century, a transformation began to occur in how people approached the study of matter. The mystical and symbolic framework of alchemy started to give way to something more systematic, more openly shared, more focused on understanding rather than simply achieving practical results. Robert Boyle, working in England and Ireland in the 1600s, embodied the shift. He conducted careful experiments with gases, with combustion, with the properties of air. He developed an improved air pump, allowing him to create partial vacuums and observe how substances behaved in the absence of air. He found that a flame would not burn without air, that animals could not survive without air, that sound did not travel in a vacuum. Boyle published his findings openly, writing in clear language rather than alchemical codes. He emphasized reproducibility, the idea that experiments should be described clearly enough that others could repeat them and verify the results. This seems obvious now, but it represented a profound change in how knowledge about matter was shared and validated. He questioned the Aristotelian four elements, arguing instead that elements should be defined as the simplest substances into which matter could be divided, substances that could not be broken down further. This was a crucial conceptual shift, moving away from philosophical speculation toward operational definitions based on experiment. In his book, The Skeptical Chymist, published in 1661, Boyle challenged both the four-element theory of the ancient Greeks and the three-principle theory popular among alchemists: sulfur, mercury, and salt. He argued for a more empirical approach, observing what actually happened when substances were heated or mixed or separated, rather than imposing preconceived frameworks, the air itself became an object of intense investigation. What was this invisible substance that surrounded everything, that was essential for fire and for life? Different investigators began to realize that air was not a single pure element, but rather a mixture of different substances. Joseph Black, working in Scotland in the 1700s, investigated what he called fixed air, what we now know as carbon dioxide. He showed that this gas was produced when certain carbonates were heated, and that it was the same gas produced by respiration and by burning. He demonstrated that it was denser than ordinary air, that it extinguished flames, that it could be absorbed by alkaline solutions. Black's work was meticulous. He weighed substances before and after chemical reactions, measuring the changes with precision. This quantitative approach, applying careful measurement to chemical processes, would become increasingly important, transforming chemistry from a primarily qualitative science into one based on exact measurements and mathematical relationships. Joseph Priestley, an English clergyman and natural philosopher, conducted extensive experiments with different kinds of air, or gases as they would come to be called. He isolated and studied what he called dephlogisticated air, a gas in which flames burned brighter and mice lived longer. This was oxygen, though Priestley himself never fully abandoned the phlogiston theory to understand its true nature. The phlogiston theory held that combustible materials contained a substance called phlogiston that was released during burning. When something burned completely, it had released all its phlogiston. This theory explained many observations why metals gained weight when they burned. They were supposedly losing light phlogiston and retaining heavy residue, but it ultimately proved to be wrong. An elegant idea that didn't match reality. In France, Antoine Lavoisier was conducting his own careful experiments, weighing substances before and after reactions with unprecedented precision. He heated mercury in a closed container, carefully measuring the air and the mercury and the red powder that formed. He noticed that when mercury was heated, it combined with part of the air, and the remaining air would not support combustion or life. When he collected the red powder and heated it more intensely, the mercury returned, and the gas released was the same as Priestley's dephlogisticated air. Lavoisier realized that combustion was not about releasing phlogiston, but about combining with this component of air. He named it oxygen, from Greek words meaning acid former, because he believed it was essential for forming acids. Lavoisier's work in the 1780s and 90s established the law of conservation of mass. The principle that in chemical reactions matter is neither created nor destroyed, but only transformed. Total mass before a reaction equals total mass after. This seems simple, but it was revolutionary. Providing a foundation for understanding chemical change through careful measurement and balance, he developed a new system for naming chemical compounds, working with other French chemists to create a logical nomenclature based on the elements that composed each substance. This system replaced the confused multitude of traditional names: oil of vitriol and butter of antimony and lunar caustic, with names that indicated composition: sulfuric acid and antimony, chloride, and silver nitrate. This new language made chemistry more accessible, more logical. It allowed chemists to communicate precisely about substances and reactions, to see patterns and relationships that had been obscured by traditional naming. It represented chemistry becoming a true science with systematic methods and clear terminology. Lavoisier also compiled a list of elements, substances that could not be decomposed by any known means. His list included true elements like oxygen and nitrogen and hydrogen, but also some substances that would later be found to be compounds. His approach was sound even if his list was imperfect. Elements were defined operationally by what they were observed to be, not by philosophical preconceptions. Tragically, Lavoisier was guillotined during the French Revolution in 1794, a victim of political upheaval. His contributions to chemistry were deemed irrelevant by revolutionary tribunals focused on his former role as a tax collector. A colleague reportedly said that it took only a moment to cut off his head. But France might not produce another like it in a century. The loss was profound, a brilliant mind silenced at the height of his productivity. Yet his work survived him. The new chemistry he had helped establish continued to develop. Other investigators built on his foundations, exploring the properties of elements, studying how they combined, measuring the proportions in which substances reacted. John Dalton, an English schoolteacher with a deep curiosity about the natural world, proposed in the early 1800s that each element consisted of identical atoms with a specific weight, and that compounds formed when atoms of different elements combined in definite, simple ratios, 1 to 1, 1 to 2, 2 to 3. This atomic theory revived and refined the ancient ideas of Democritus, but now grounded them in experimental observation and measurement. Dalton assigned relative weights to the atoms of different elements, using hydrogen as the standard with a weight of 1. His values weren't always accurate, but the principle was sound. Each element had atoms of characteristic mass, and these masses determined the proportions in which elements combined. He explained why a given compound always had the same composition, why water was always 2 parts hydrogen to 1 part oxygen by volume, why carbon dioxide was always carbon combined with oxygen in a specific ratio, because compounds were formed by atoms combining in definite whole number proportions. Dalton was colorblind, which he investigated scientifically, writing the first detailed description of the condition. He was quiet, methodical, keeping detailed weather records every day for more than 50 years. He approached chemistry with the same patient observational spirit, accumulating data, looking for pattern, building theory from careful measurement. As the 19th century progressed, more elements were discovered and isolated. Humphrey Davy in England used electricity to decompose compounds, isolating sodium and potassium by passing electric current through molten salts. These reactive metals had never been seen in pure form before. Sodium, soft enough to cut with a knife, shining silver, reacting violently with water. Potassium, even more reactive, bursting into flame when exposed to water. Davy also isolated calcium, magnesium, barium, strontium, demonstrating that electricity could break apart compounds that resisted other methods of decomposition. This electrochemical approach opened new possibilities, revealing elements that had been locked in compounds, showing that chemical bonds could be understood in terms of electrical forces. Jöns Jacob Berzelius in Sweden determined the atomic weights of many elements with remarkable accuracy. He analyzed thousands of compounds, carefully measuring their compositions. He introduced the system of using letter symbols for elements: H for hydrogen, O for oxygen, C for carbon. This notation made chemical formulas much simpler to write and understand. Water became H2O, showing its composition clearly and concisely. Berzelius also coined important chemical terms still used today. He distinguished between organic chemistry, the study of carbon-containing compounds associated with living things, and inorganic chemistry, the study of other substances. This division would prove somewhat artificial, but it reflected observed differences in how these compounds behaved. The discovery of new elements continued throughout the century. Some were found in rare minerals, extracted through painstaking chemical procedures. Others were detected through new analytical techniques, like spectroscopy, which revealed the presence of elements by the characteristic colors they produced when heated in a flame. Cesium and rubidium were discovered this way in the 1860s, identified by the unique lines in their emission spectra before anyone had isolated macroscopic samples. Helium was first detected in the sun's spectrum before being found on Earth. Its name derives from Helios, the Greek sun god. Patterns began to emerge as more elements were characterized. Certain elements seemed to have similar properties. Lithium, sodium, and potassium, all soft reactive metals, chlorine, bromine, and iodine, all reactive nonmetals that formed similar compounds. Investigators began arranging elements in various schemes, trying to find order in the growing list. Dmitry Mendeleev, a Russian chemist with wild hair and an unconventional spirit, made the breakthrough in 1869. He arranged elements by atomic weight, but left gaps where properties suggested elements should be. He predicted the properties of these missing elements with remarkable accuracy. When gallium was discovered a few years later, it matched his predictions almost exactly. His periodic table revealed that properties repeated at regular intervals. Chemical behavior was not random, but followed patterns based on atomic weight and structure. Elements in the same column had similar properties. The table had holes, suggesting undiscovered elements. It had an elegant logic that hinted at deeper underlying order. Mendeleev's table was not immediately accepted, but as predicted elements were discovered and found to match his descriptions, it became clear that he had found something fundamental. The periodic table became the organizing framework for all of chemistry, a map of the elements showing relationships and patterns. Yet even as Mendeleev's table brought order to the elements, deeper questions remained. Why did elements have these specific properties? Why did the pattern repeat? What determined an element's chemical behavior? The answers would come from discoveries about the internal structure of atoms themselves. In 1895, Wilhelm Röntgen discovered mysterious rays that could pass through paper and wood and even flesh, revealing the bones within. He called them X-rays, marking their unknown nature. These rays emerged when fast-moving electrons struck metal targets, though neither electrons nor their role were yet understood. The following year, Henri Becquerel in France discovered that uranium compounds emitted their own penetrating radiation without any external stimulation. Photographic plates wrapped in black paper were fogged when placed near uranium salts. Something was radiating from the uranium itself, constantly, inexplicably. Marie Curie, working with her husband Pierre in a cold, converted shed in Paris, investigated this phenomenon with intense determination. She coined the term radioactivity and set about measuring it in various substances. She found that the intensity of radiation was proportional to the amount of uranium present, suggesting it was an atomic property, not a molecular one, working through tons of pitch-blende ore. The Curies painstakingly isolated two new elements, both more radioactive than uranium. They named one polonium, after Marie's native Poland, and the other radium, from the Latin word for ray. The work was physically exhausting, stirring boiling solutions with iron rods nearly as tall as Marie herself, breathing fumes, exposed to radiation they didn't yet understand as dangerous. Radium glowed in the dark with a soft blue-green light, its radiation continuing endlessly, seemingly violating the conservation of energy. Where was this energy coming from? The implications were staggering. The atom was not indivisible after all, not a solid, unchanging sphere as Dalton had imagined, but something more complex, something that could transform, releasing energy in the process. Ernest Rutherford, a New Zealander working in England and Canada, investigated radioactive emissions, identifying two types: alpha particles, which could be stopped by paper, and beta particles, which penetrated further. A third type, gamma rays, similar to X-rays but more energetic, was identified by others. Rutherford showed that alpha particles were helium atoms stripped of their electrons, and that when radioactive elements emitted these particles, they transformed into different elements. Uranium slowly became thorium, which became another element, and so on down a chain of transformations. The alchemist's dream of transmutation was real after all, not achieved through chemical processes, but occurring spontaneously in certain elements. In 1911, Rutherford proposed a revolutionary model of atomic structure based on experiments where alpha particles were fired at thin gold foil. Most passed through, but occasionally one bounced back at a sharp angle. He concluded that atoms were mostly empty space, with a tiny dense nucleus at the center containing most of the mass, and electrons orbiting this nucleus like planets around a sun. This nuclear model explained many observations, but it created new puzzles. According to classical physics, orbiting electrons should continuously radiate energy and spiral into the nucleus in a fraction of a second. Atoms should be unstable, yet they persisted. Something was missing from the theory. Niels Bohr, a Danish physicist working with Rutherford, proposed that electrons could only exist in certain specific orbits, quantum states with discrete energies. Electrons could jump from one orbit to another, absorbing or emitting energy in precise amounts, but they could not exist between these allowed states. This quantum model explained the spectral lines of hydrogen beautifully. The specific wavelengths of light emitted corresponded exactly to the energy difference between allowed orbits. It was strange and unprecedented, imposing discrete jumps where classical physics predicted continuous change. But it matched experimental observations with uncanny precision. The understanding deepened through the 1920s and 30s. Louis de Broglie proposed that electrons had wave-like properties as well as particle-like properties. Werner Heisenberg and Erwin Schrödinger developed mathematical frameworks for quantum mechanics, describing electrons not as particles in definite orbits, but as wave functions, probability distributions showing where electrons were likely to be found. In this quantum world, electrons occupied orbitals, three-dimensional regions around the nucleus. The periodic table's pattern finally made sense. Elements in the same column had similar properties because they had the same number of electrons in their outermost orbitals. Chemical behavior was determined by these outer electrons, their arrangement, their availability for sharing or transferring to other atoms. The chemical bond itself came into focus. Gilbert Lewis proposed that atoms shared pairs of electrons to form covalent bonds, creating stable arrangements. This sharing explained why hydrogen formed H2 molecules, why oxygen formed O2, why water was H2O with the oxygen atom sharing electrons with two hydrogen atoms. Linus Pauling extended these ideas, describing how orbitals could blend or hybridize, explaining molecular shapes and bond strengths. He introduced the concept of electronegativity, a measure of how strongly an atom attracts electrons, allowing predictions about whether bonds would be ionic, with electrons transferred from one atom to another, or covalent, with electrons shared, or something in between. The 20th century saw chemistry expand in every direction. Organic chemistry grew enormously as chemists learned to synthesize complex molecules, creating dyes and drugs and plastics and countless other materials. The German chemical industry became dominant in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, producing synthetic indigo that replaced natural dye sources, creating aspirin and other pharmaceuticals, developing processes for industrial-scale production. Fritz Haber developed a process for synthesizing ammonia from nitrogen and hydrogen, crucial for producing fertilizers and explosives. The process required high temperatures and pressures, with iron catalysts facilitating the reaction. It transformed agriculture, allowing the production of nitrogen fertilizers without relying on natural nitrate deposits, supporting a vast increase in food production, though also enabling modern warfare through abundant explosives. The same chemical knowledge that created fertilizers and medicines also produced poison gases used in World War I, chlorine and phosgene and mustard gas, drifting across battlefields, causing terrible suffering. Chemistry's power was neutral, capable of healing or harming, depending on human choices. This duality would become even more apparent as the century progressed. Polymers emerged as a major field. Leo Baekeland created the first fully synthetic plastic, Bakelite, in 1907, opening an era of materials that didn't exist in nature. Wallace Carothers at DuPont developed nylon, the first fully synthetic fiber, strong enough to replace silk in parachutes, versatile enough to become ubiquitous in clothing and countless other applications. The understanding of chemical kinetics advanced. How fast do reactions proceed? What factors affect reaction rates, temperature, concentration, catalysts? Each variable could be studied, measured, related to the molecular processes underlying visible changes. Arrhenius developed equations relating temperature to reaction rate, explaining why chemical processes speed up when heated. Analytical chemistry became increasingly sophisticated. Instruments could detect and measure substances in tiny concentrations, spectroscopy in various forms, infrared, ultraviolet, nuclear magnetic resonance, each revealing different aspects of molecular structure. Mass spectrometry could determine molecular weights and fragment patterns, providing detailed structural information. Chromatography allowed separation of complex mixtures, components moving at different rates through a medium, emerging separately where they could be collected and analyzed. This technique became essential for analyzing everything from blood samples to environmental pollutants, from flavoring compounds to drugs. The electron microscope revealed structures at scales impossible with light. Viruses became visible. The detailed architecture of crystals could be examined. Later, scanning tunneling microscopes would allow imaging of individual atoms, making visible what Democritus could only imagine: those ultimate particles arranged in precise geometric patterns. Biochemistry emerged as a discipline, studying the chemical processes within living organisms. Enzymes were revealed as protein catalysts of extraordinary specificity and efficiency. The structure of proteins was gradually worked out, long chains of amino acids folding into precise three-dimensional shapes, their function depending on their form. The discovery of DNA's structure by Watson and Crick in 1953, building on Rosalind Franklin's X-ray crystallography data, revealed the molecular basis of heredity. The double helix with its complementary base pairs explained how genetic information was stored and replicated. All of life's diversity ultimately came down to chemistry, to sequences of nucleotides encoding sequences of amino acids that folded into proteins that carried out the functions of life. Chemistry had come full circle, in a sense, from ancient attempts to understand life's essence through material transformation, through centuries of accumulated practical knowledge and theoretical development, to a molecular understanding of life itself, the mechanisms of inheritance, of metabolism, of cellular function, all revealed as chemistry, as the orchestrated interactions of molecules following the same principles that governed simpler reactions in flasks and beakers. Environmental chemistry emerged as pressing concerns. DDT and other persistent pesticides lead in gasoline and paint, acid rain from industrial emissions, the thinning ozone layer. Chemistry had created many of these problems, but chemistry also provided the understanding needed to address them, to measure pollutants, to understand their effects, to develop alternatives. The development of computational chemistry allowed prediction of molecular properties and reaction pathways. Powerful computers could solve the quantum mechanical equations approximately, modeling molecular structures and behaviors. Drugs could be designed on computers, tested virtually before any synthesis was attempted. Materials could be optimized. Reactions could be understood in unprecedented detail. As the 20th century ended and the 21st began, chemistry had become deeply integrated with other sciences: materials science, nanotechnology, biochemistry, environmental science. The boundaries blurred as problems required interdisciplinary approaches. Yet the fundamental questions remained chemical. How do atoms and molecules interact? What determines structure and reactivity? How can we harness these principles to create desired outcomes? And beneath all the sophistication, all the advanced instruments and computational models, the core principles remain those discovered through centuries of patient observation, conservation of mass and energy, the periodic properties of elements, the quantum nature of matter, the relationship between structure and function. These principles, discovered through countless experiments in laboratories, quiet and bustling, in universities and industries, by individuals driven by curiosity or practical need, formed the foundation of our material world. The story of chemistry is not finished. New materials are being created, new drugs discovered, new processes developed, but perhaps there is value in pausing here, in this quiet moment, to contemplate what has been learned, to appreciate the journey from fire to quantum mechanics, from gold-seeking alchemists to genome-editing biochemists, all asking fundamentally similar questions about the nature of matter and transformation. The deeper one looks into chemistry, the more it reveals about the fundamental nature of reality itself. Every solid object, every liquid, every gas is composed of particles in constant motion, vibrating, rotating, moving through space. Even when everything appears perfectly still, at room temperature, the molecules in the air are moving at speeds of hundreds of meters per second, colliding billions of times per second. Yet we perceive only stillness and silence. The water in a glass appears calm, but its molecules are in ceaseless agitation, hydrogen bonds forming and breaking in femtoseconds, a time scale so brief that light travels only a fraction of a hair's width. This hidden dynamism exists everywhere, in the wood of a table, in the fabric of clothing, in the cells of our bodies. Nothing is truly at rest. Everything participates in an endless molecular dance, following the laws of thermodynamics, tending toward equilibrium, yet capable of remarkable organization and order. Consider a snowflake, each one unique, yet each one following the same basic hexagonal symmetry. The shape emerges from the way water molecules bond to each other, from the angles determined by the arrangement of electrons around oxygen and hydrogen atoms, from quantum mechanics to ice crystal geometry, from the invisible to the visible. The connection is direct and beautiful. Or consider the colors we see. The blue of the sky results from how air molecules scatter sunlight, preferentially scattering shorter blue wavelengths. The red of a rose comes from pigment molecules that absorb certain wavelengths and reflect others. The green of leaves, chlorophyll molecules capturing photons and using their energy to drive chemical reactions that build sugars from carbon dioxide and water. Color itself is chemistry made visible. Every hue and shade arising from molecular structure, from the arrangement of atoms and the behavior of electrons. The sunset's orange and red, the ocean's varied blues, the infinite gradations of autumn leaves, all chemical phenomena, all expressions of how matter interacts with light. The energy that powers nearly everything on Earth's surface comes ultimately from nuclear reactions in the sun's core, hydrogen fusing into helium, releasing energy that travels as light across space, to be captured by plants, to be stored in chemical bonds, to flow through food chains and ecosystems. Chemistry and physics intertwined, matter and energy in constant exchange. Even our thoughts and feelings have a chemical dimension. Neurotransmitters crossing synapses, hormones traveling through bloodstreams, proteins folding and unfolding in response to signals. The experience of consciousness emerges from chemistry, from the coordinated activity of molecules in the vast network of the brain. This doesn't diminish the mystery, but rather deepens it. How does chemistry become experience? How does matter become aware of itself? The question brings us back to ancient philosophical puzzles, but now with molecular specificity. We know which molecules are involved in memory formation, which ones create feelings of pleasure or pain, which ones regulate sleep and wakefulness. Yet the gap between knowing the mechanism and understanding the experience remains. Chemistry gives us the how, but not quite the why. Perhaps there is something profound in chemistry's insistence on transformation. Nothing is permanent. Everything is in flux. Iron rusts, diamonds can burn, even gold slowly exchanges atoms with its surroundings. The substance persists, but the particular atoms come and go, replaced gradually over time. Our own bodies demonstrate this. The calcium in our bones is not the same calcium that was there years ago. The carbon in our cells has been cycled through the atmosphere, through plants, through other organisms. We are temporary arrangements of atoms borrowed from the environment, assembled into the pattern of a human body, maintained through constant chemical work, eventually to be returned and redistributed. This view is both humbling and connecting. We are not separate from the material world, but continuous with it. The iron in our blood was forged in ancient stars. The oxygen we breathe was produced by photosynthesis. The water in our cells has cycled through clouds and rivers and oceans. We are made of the world, and we will return to it. Atoms persisting, patterns dissolving and reforming. Chemistry also teaches us about emergence, how properties arise that cannot be predicted from components alone. Hydrogen and oxygen, both gases, combine to form liquid water with properties utterly unlike either element, sodium, a metal that reacts violently with water, and chlorine, a poisonous gas, combine to form table salt, essential for life. The whole is genuinely different from the sum of parts. This emergence happens at every level. Atoms form molecules with new properties. Molecules form cells with the property of life. Cells form organisms with consciousness. At each level, new possibilities emerge, new behaviors, new phenomena that could not exist at simpler levels of organization, and yet the fundamental rules remain the same. The quantum mechanics governing electrons in atoms also governs electrons in molecules, in cells, in brains. The laws of thermodynamics apply to chemical reactions in beakers and to the complex metabolism of living organisms. Unity underlies diversity. Simple rules generate endless complexity. There is something almost musical about chemistry. Harmonic relationships in the periodic table, resonance structures in molecules, the rhythms of oscillating reactions, systems seeking equilibrium, sometimes overshooting and oscillating before settling, like waves gradually damping, like sounds fading into silence. The Belousov's Jabotinsky reaction demonstrates this beautifully, a mixture of chemicals that oscillates between colors, red and blue, back and forth, in waves spreading through the solution, pattern and rhythm emerging from chemistry alone, no life required, just the right combination of molecules and conditions, creating order from chaos, temporarily, before eventually running down toward equilibrium. All chemistry moves toward equilibrium, that state of maximum entropy, of uniform distribution, of no more potential for change. And yet, we exist far from equilibrium, maintained by constant flows of energy and matter, eating, breathing, burning fuel, dissipating heat, creating local order at the expense of increasing disorder elsewhere. Life itself is chemistry kept persistently out of equilibrium. A cell dies when it reaches equilibrium with its surroundings. Life requires difference, concentration gradients, energy flows, the ability to harness these differences to do work, to maintain organization, to repair damage, to grow and reproduce. This is the deep insight of thermodynamics. Order requires energy. Complexity requires work, the intricate beauty of living things, the precise folding of proteins, the replication of DNA, all sustained by energy flowing from high-quality sources like sunlight toward the low-quality heat of the universe. We are all participants in this vast flow, temporary eddies in the stream. And so, as these thoughts settle like dust motes finding stillness, as the images of laboratories and reactions and glowing elements fade into softer focus, there remains a quiet sense of connection to something vast and ancient. The same forces that combined hydrogen and helium in the first stars, that forged heavier elements in supernovae, that condensed matter into planets, that sparked the first self-replicating molecules. These forces continue their work in every breath, in every moment. Chemistry asks nothing of us but observation. It proceeds whether we understand it or not. Rust forms on iron, sugar dissolves in water, wood burns to ash. The universe goes on with its transformations, indifferent to our understanding, yet open to our investigation. There is comfort in this, in the reliability of natural law, in the consistency of chemical behavior. Water always freezes at the same temperature, under the same conditions. Hydrogen and oxygen always combine in the same proportions. The periodic table's pattern holds true everywhere we can observe, on Earth, in meteorites, in the spectra of distant stars. This universality suggests something profound, that the rules governing matter are not local, not arbitrary, but fundamental to the structure of reality itself. Chemistry would work the same way anywhere in the universe. The same elements would have the same properties. The same bonds would form. The same reactions would proceed. Somewhere, perhaps, on a planet circling a distant star, water might be flowing. Carbon-based molecules might be organizing into life. Chemistry working out its patterns in conditions we can barely imagine. The details would differ, but the underlying principles would be the same. This thought connects us to the cosmos, makes us less alone in the vastness. The story of chemistry is ultimately a story about change and continuity, about transformation within constancy. Elements persist even as they combine and recombine. Atoms remain even as molecules form and break apart. The fundamental particles endure through countless rearrangements. We ourselves are part of this story, not observers standing outside, but participants fully embedded in the chemical world. Our bodies are chemistry. Our thoughts emerge from chemistry. Our awareness, in this moment, reflecting on chemistry, is itself a chemical phenomenon. Neurons firing, neurotransmitters crossing gaps, electrical signals propagating through networks of cells. And yet knowing this doesn't diminish the wonder. If anything, it deepens it. The fact that matter, arranged in particular ways, following chemical and physical laws, can become aware, can ponder its own existence, can ask questions about the nature of reality. This seems almost miraculous, yet it is simply what chemistry does. Given enough time, enough complexity, enough energy flowing through the system, perhaps that is the deepest lesson, that there is no clear boundary between the living and the non-living, between the conscious and the unconscious, between spirit and matter, only different levels of organization, different degrees of complexity, all following the same fundamental rules, all part of the same continuous reality. The alchemists sought to perfect matter, to find the philosopher's stone, to achieve transmutation. In a sense, We are the transmutation they sought. We are matter that has become conscious of itself, atoms organized into patterns that can think and feel and wonder, the base metal of simple elements transformed into the gold of awareness. This transformation required no magical catalyst, no secret formula, only time and the patient working out of chemical and physical law. Billions of years of stars forming and exploding, of planets coalescing and evolving, of molecules combining and competing and gradually organizing into life, of nervous systems developing and consciousness emerging. And now, in this moment, chemistry continues. Oxygen is being transported through bloodstreams. Carbon dioxide is being released. Molecules are binding to receptors. Enzymes are catalyzing reactions. The vast coordinated chemistry of life proceeds, mostly unconscious, mostly automatic, requiring no deliberate thought or attention. The night deepens, or perhaps it is simply the thoughts that deepen, settling like sediment in a still water. The questions remain, but they feel less urgent now, less demanding of answers, content simply to exist, to be held gently in awareness. Chemistry will continue its patient work, in laboratory and in nature, in industry and in living cells, transforming substances, revealing new possibilities, creating materials that never existed before, solving problems, sometimes creating new ones, always exploring the space of what is possible within the constraints of physical law. But for now, there is just this quiet contemplation, this sense of connection to the material world, this appreciation for the elegant simplicity underlying endless complexity. The periodic table hangs in memory, elements arranged in their rows and columns, each one a thread in the vast tapestry of matter, each one playing its part in the ongoing story. The story has no end, only pauses, only moments of rest between transformations, and in this pause, in this stillness, there is everything and nothing, just the gentle awareness of being, of existing as a temporary pattern in the flow, of participating in chemistry's ancient dance. The words fade now, like the last light fading from the sky, like heat gradually dissipating into the surroundings, like a reaction approaching equilibrium. The story settles into silence, into the deep quiet, from which all things emerge and to which all things return. And there is only this moment, this breath, this gentle letting go.